Have you ever wondered about the invisible forces that shaped the modern world? The forgotten empires, whose echoes still whisper through the cobblestone streets of Europe? Or perhaps how a small, relatively obscure patch of land could blossom into a military powerhouse that fundamentally altered the course of history? It's a bit like finding a dusty old family photo album in your attic and realizing the stern-faced relative staring back at you was actually a secret agent, perpetually shaping events from the shadows. That's a bit how it feels with Prussia, a name that conjures images of disciplined soldiers, iron resolve, and perhaps a touch of stern, no-nonsense efficiency. Yet its origins are far stranger and more mysterious than many realize. It wasn't always the rigid, militaristic state we often imagine. Instead, it began as something far more fluid, a tapestry woven from disparate threads of tribal migrations, crusading knights, and the slow, often violent, ebb and flow of power in medieval Europe. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Well, our story begins not with kings and crowns, but with a swirling mist of ancient history, deep within the forests and along the amber-rich coastlines of what we now call the southeastern Baltic Sea, where a collection of indigenous Baltic tribes, often referred to broadly as the Old Prussians, lived their lives, largely unbothered by the grand machinations of the Western European powers. These were independent folks, speaking their own unique languages, worshipping their own gods of nature, and living in a way that, if we're honest, sounds rather idyllic compared to the feudal chaos unfolding elsewhere. Imagine a place where your biggest worry was probably whether the fish were biting, not whether a heavily armored knight was about to demand taxes. They had their own social structures, their own forms of governance, and a rich oral tradition that spoke of their ancestors and their deep connection to the land, a connection that would soon be brutally severed. These early Prussians were not a unified political entity in the way we understand states today. Rather, they were a collection of distinct tribal groups, each with its own customs and leadership, often engaged in localized skirmishes, but possessing a collective identity rooted in their shared language and spiritual beliefs. They were, in essence, a complex mosaic of communities, existing on the periphery of the emerging Christian kingdoms, largely undisturbed until the gaze of the wider world began to fall upon their rich, pagan lands. It was into this relatively untouched landscape that the first whispers of a new, forceful presence began to drift, carried on the chill Baltic winds. These were the whispers of the cross and the sword, for beyond their forested borders, the Christianization of Europe was in full swing, and with it came the crusading zeal that sought to bring all heathens into the fold, whether they wanted to join or not. Now, you might think of crusades as happening primarily in the Holy Land, dusty and desert hot. But there were also northern crusades, often overlooked in the grand historical narrative, that aimed to convert or conquer the remaining pagan peoples of the Baltic region. The Polish dukes, in particular, found themselves constantly battling these resilient Prussian tribes on their northern borders, a persistent thorn in their expansionist side, leading them to look for a more permanent solution to their pagan problem. They needed a heavy hitter, someone with both the military might and the spiritual conviction to get the job done. And as luck, or perhaps misfortune for the old Prussians would have it, just such an organization was looking for a new mission. This was a time when faith and brute force were often indistinguishable, and the idea of converting someone at the point of a sword wasn't seen as contradictory, but rather as a necessary act of divine will. And so, like a highly specialized, religiously motivated wrecking ball, the Teutonic Knights entered the stage in the early 13th century, invited by Duke Conrad I of Masovia in 1226 to help subdue the troublesome Prussians. Now, these weren't your average knights. They were a German Catholic military order, formed originally in Acre during the Third Crusade, and by this point, they were essentially a well-oiled machine of holy war, possessing an iron discipline, a sophisticated organizational structure, and a deep-seated commitment to their cause. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of a corporate merger between a monastic order and a highly efficient, heavily armed private security firm. Their initial mission was ostensibly to protect Conrad's borders from the Prussian raids. But the Knights, being the shrewd operators they were, had far grander ambitions. They saw not just a border dispute, but an opportunity to carve out their own independent theocratic state in the largely unconquered pagan lands, a vision that, frankly, put Conrad's little border problem to shame. They quickly established a foothold, building formidable brick castles that dotted the landscape, each one a stark, unyielding symbol of their growing power and their unwavering intent to stay. It was a classic case of inviting a wolf into the fold to deal with a fox, only to find the wolf had its eye on the entire flock. The Knights wasted no time in executing their vision, embarking on a brutal and systematic campaign to conquer and convert the old Prussians, a process that unfolded over decades of intense, bloody conflict. They weren't just about winning battles. They were about total subjugation, pushing relentlessly eastward, building a network of fortresses, and establishing administrative centers wherever they secured territory. The indigenous Prussian tribes, despite their fierce resistance and intimate knowledge of the terrain, were ultimately outmatched by the Knights' superior organization, discipline, and weaponry. It was a clash of worlds, really, between a decentralized tribal society and a highly centralized, militarized religious order. This period saw the wholesale destruction of the old Prussian way of life, their pagan shrines replaced by churches, their languages slowly eroded by German, and their populations either converted, killed, or assimilated. Historians still argue whether the scale of the old Prussian demographic decline was primarily due to direct violence or the devastating impact of introduced diseases and the societal upheaval. But the outcome was undeniable. The original inhabitants of Prussia were effectively absorbed or eliminated, paving the way for a new German-dominated order. It was a stark example of conquest, leaving a deep, complex scar on the land and its identity, forever altering the demographic and cultural landscape of the region, and laying the very, very grim foundation for what would one day become the formidable state of Prussia. As the dust of conquest began to settle, a new entity emerged from the crucible of crusading zeal and indigenous resistance: the monastic state of the Teutonic Order, a truly unique political and religious experiment in medieval Europe. Imagine a country run by warrior monks, sworn to poverty and chastity, yet wielding immense temporal power, building grand castles, and engaging in sophisticated trade networks. It's like if a highly effective medieval multinational corporation decided its core business was well, God, but with a significant side hustle in real estate and conquest, this state was unlike any other, with the Grand Master of the Order serving as its supreme ruler, combining religious authority with absolute temporal control over vast territories acquired through decades of relentless warfare and strategic diplomacy. They weren't just praying and fighting, they were also incredibly astute administrators, establishing a highly organized system of governance that allowed them to effectively manage their growing domain, implement laws, and extract resources. Their economic engine was fueled by agriculture, particularly grain, which they exported across the Baltic, and perhaps more famously, by the lucrative amber trade, a prehistoric resin found abundantly along the Prussian coast that was highly prized for jewelry and decorative items across Europe. Think of it as their medieval version of oil. Everyone wanted it, and the knights had the monopoly. They built impressive fortified towns and castles, like the massive Marienburg, which served as the Order's headquarters, a true testament to their engineering prowess and their desire to project an image of impregnable power. These architectural marvels weren't just defensive structures. They were also centers of administration, trade, and even cultural exchange, drawing in merchants and craftsmen from across the Holy Roman Empire and beyond, gradually transforming the landscape from a series of scattered tribal settlements into a more organized, albeit rigidly controlled, proto-state. This period also saw significant German immigration into the conquered territories, as the knights actively encouraged settlers from the Holy Roman Empire to cultivate the land and populate their new towns, further cementing the Germanization of the region and slowly diluting the remnants of old Prussian culture. Yet, despite their apparent strength and disciplined organization, the monastic state carried within it the seeds of its own eventual decline, a slow unraveling driven by a combination of internal contradictions and escalating external pressures. For all their piety, the knights were, at their core, a military machine and constant warfare. Even victorious warfare is an expensive business, both in terms of manpower and treasure. Their strict monastic vows, which forbade personal wealth, ironically led to the accumulation of immense institutional wealth, creating a tension between their spiritual ideals and their very worldly ambitions. It's a bit like a modern-day non-profit that becomes so good at fundraising, it starts buying private jets, slowly losing sight of its original charitable mission. Furthermore, their very success bred resentment and powerful enemies, especially among their neighbors, who grew increasingly wary of the Order's insatiable appetite for expansion. The relationship with Poland, their erstwhile ally who had invited them in, became particularly strained. A tangled knot of territorial disputes, economic rivalries, and conflicting claims over strategic regions like Pomerania and Danzig. Poland, seeing the monster it had inadvertently helped create, began to actively challenge the Order's dominance, leading to a series of escalating conflicts that would chip away at the Knights' power. The Lithuanian Grand Duchy, another powerful neighbor, also posed a significant threat, especially after its union with Poland in 1386, creating a formidable combined force that the Teutonic Knights found increasingly difficult to contend with. The once clear lines between pagan and Christian, which had justified the Order's very existence, also began to blur as Lithuania converted to Christianity, undermining the Knights' crusading raison d'etre and making it harder to garner support and resources from Western Europe. One of the most devastating blows came in 1410 at the Battle of Grunwald, or Tannenberg as the Germans called it, a catastrophic defeat for the Teutonic Knights at the hands of a combined Polish-Lithuanian army. Imagine the most disciplined, seemingly invincible army of its time suffering a monumental rout, losing thousands of knights, including their Grand Master, in a single day. It was the medieval equivalent of a stock market crash and a natural disaster rolled into one, utterly shattering their military prestige and financial stability. This wasn't just a lost battle. It was a psychological and material blow from which the order would never fully recover, marking a turning point in their fortunes and signaling the beginning of their protracted decline. The financial strain of maintaining their vast network of castles and supporting their standing army became unbearable, forcing them to borrow heavily and impose increasingly burdensome taxes on their subjects, leading to widespread discontent and even open rebellion within their own territories. Indeed, the growing dissatisfaction among the cities and nobility within the monastic state, tired of the order's autocratic rule and heavy taxation, culminated in the formation of the Prussian Confederation in 1440. This was an alliance of Prussian towns and nobles who, fed up with the knights' iron fist, sought to break free from their control and align themselves with the Polish crown, seeing Poland as a more palatable alternative to the increasingly tyrannical and financially strapped order. It's akin to a group of disgruntled employees deciding to unionize and then, finding no joy, approaching a rival company for a takeover bid. This internal revolt, combined with the external pressure from Poland, ignited the devastating 13 Years' War, 1454-1466, a conflict that bled the Teutonic order dry and irrevocably altered the political landscape of the Baltic region. Historians still argue whether the Prussian Confederation's motivations were purely economic, seeking lower taxes and greater autonomy, or if there was a deeper, nascent sense of regional identity that drove their rebellion against the Knights' foreign rule, making the precise blend of pragmatism and nascent patriotism a subject of ongoing scholarly debate. The war was a grinding, brutal affair, fought largely by mercenary armies, which only exacerbated the order's financial woes, forcing them to pawn off territories and effectively mortgage their future. By the time the Second Peace of Thorn was signed in 1466, the Teutonic Order had been decisively defeated, losing significant swaths of its territory to Poland and becoming a vassal of the Polish crown for the remaining parts. This marked the effective end of their independent monastic state and transformed them from a formidable regional power into a subordinate entity, a shadow of their former glory. The once proud and independent monastic state, built on crusading ideals and military might, had crumbled under the weight of its own ambition and the relentless pressure from its neighbors and its own discontented subjects, setting the stage for the next, equally complex chapter in the history of Prussia, a chapter that would see the emergence of a new, equally ambitious, but far more secular power. With the signing of the Second Peace of Thorn in 1466, the once mighty monastic state of the Teutonic Order was effectively dismembered, its independent power broken, and a new pivotal relationship forged that would fundamentally reshape the future of the region. The Prussian homage to the Polish crown. Imagine a powerful corporate entity, after a series of disastrous mergers and acquisitions, being forced to become a subsidiary of its fiercest competitor, its grand ambitions now circumscribed by the will of a new overlord. The western part of the Order's territory, including strategic cities like Danzig and Thorn, was directly incorporated into the Kingdom of Poland as Royal Prussia, a significant territorial gain for the Polish monarchy and a bitter loss for the Knights. The eastern remaining portion of the Order's lands, however, was transformed into the Duchy of Prussia, and critically, it became a feudal dependency, owing allegiance and military service to the King of Poland. This wasn't just a political reshuffle. It was a profound humiliation for an organization that had once lorded over the region with an iron fist, now reduced to a vassal, its grand master kneeling before the Polish monarch. It truly felt like the end of an era, a dramatic shift in the geopolitical balance of power in Eastern Europe, leaving the Teutonic Knights to slowly fade into the background, their martial glory a relic of a bygone age. This shift marked the beginning of a period of transition, where the remnants of the old monastic order struggled to adapt to their new subordinate status, while the Polish crown sought to consolidate its control over its newly acquired territories. The Grand Masters of the Order, now technically dukes of a Polish fiefdom, found their authority severely curtailed, their decisions subject to the approval of their Polish overlords, a stark contrast to their previous absolute rule. The order itself, still clinging to its religious identity, but stripped of its independent power, became increasingly anachronistic in a rapidly secularizing Europe. The spiritual fervor that had once driven their conquests had waned, replaced by a more pragmatic and often desperate struggle for survival in a world that no longer had much use for crusading knights. It was a bit like a medieval startup that peaked too early and then found itself scrambling to pivot in a market that had moved on, its once innovative business model now obsolete. The Reformation, sweeping across Europe in the early 16th century, delivered the final, decisive blow to the anachronistic Teutonic order in Prussia. When Martin Luther's ideas began to spread, challenging the authority of the Catholic Church and advocating for a more personal faith, they found fertile ground even within the ranks of the Teutonic Knights, many of whom were questioning the purpose and legitimacy of their monastic vows. The last Grand Master of the Order, Albert of Brandenburg-Ansbach, a member of the powerful Hohenzollern dynasty, proved to be a particularly astute and pragmatic figure, recognizing the irreversible tide of change. Faced with a crumbling institution, a restive population, and the ever-present dominance of Poland, Albert made a strategic decision that would forever alter the course of Prussian history. He converted to Lutheranism in 1525. Imagine the sheer audacity and foresight of such a move, a monastic leader abandoning the very religious framework that defined his order, not out of sudden spiritual awakening, but as a calculated political maneuver. This act of conversion, known as the secularization of the monastic state, was nothing short of revolutionary, dismantling centuries of tradition in one bold stroke. By converting to Lutheranism, Albert was able to dissolve the Teutonic order in Prussia, confiscate its vast church lands and wealth, and transform the ecclesiastical state into a secular hereditary duchy, the Duchy of Prussia. This wasn't just a change of religion. It was a complete overhaul of the political and economic system, effectively transferring immense power and resources from the church to the hands of the ruling Hohenzollern family. Suddenly, The land that had been governed by warrior monks was now a proper dynastic state, subject to the whims and ambitions of a family that was quickly becoming a force to be reckoned with in German politics. This move, sanctioned by King Sigismund I of Poland, to whom Albert still owed homage, was a desperate attempt by Poland to secure its influence over the region, fearing that a continued Catholic order might eventually seek support from the Holy Roman Empire. The new Duchy of Prussia, now under the hereditary rule of the Hohenzollerns, remained a Polish fiefdom, meaning it was still legally bound to the Polish crown. However, this shift from a religious order to a secular duchy created a different kind of entity, one that was far more adaptable and capable of pursuing its own dynastic interests. The Hohenzollern family, already ruling the important German territory of Brandenburg, now had a foothold in the Baltic, a strategically vital location for trade and expansion. This wasn't yet the mighty Prussia we know, but it was a crucial embryonic stage, a slow but steady accumulation of power and influence by a shrewd and ambitious family. It was like a small, unassuming seed being planted in fertile ground, with the potential to grow into something enormous, though its eventual size and shape were far from clear at this point. The immediate impact was greater stability for the region, as the constant conflicts with the order subsided, replaced by a more conventional feudal relationship with Poland, allowing for a period of relative peace and consolidation. The secularization meant that the Duchy of Prussia was now free from the religious obligations and the anachronistic structure of the Teutonic Order, allowing its new Hohenzollern rulers to focus purely on consolidating their power and developing the state's resources. They could levy taxes directly, administer justice, and raise armies without the need for papal approval or the constraints of monastic vows. This newfound secular freedom allowed for a more efficient and centralized administration, laying the groundwork for the future growth and development of the Prussian state. While still relatively small and beholden to Poland, the duchy now possessed a critical ingredient for future success: a clear dynastic leadership with a long-term vision for its expansion and prosperity. Historians still argue whether Albert's conversion was a genuine embrace of Lutheran faith or a cynical political maneuver to secure personal power and wealth, making his true motivations a fascinating open scholarly debate that continues to intrigue researchers. The transition, however, was not entirely smooth sailing. The former members of the order, the Catholic Church, and even some segments of the population were naturally resistant to such a radical change. Yet, the momentum of the Reformation and the pragmatic advantages of secularization proved too strong to resist, firmly establishing the Duchy of Prussia as a Lutheran state and securing the Hohenzollern claim to its rule. This pivotal moment, the Prussian homage and the subsequent secularization, transformed a unique, anachronistic religious state into a more conventional, dynastic duchy, irrevocably linking its destiny with the rising power of the Hohenzollern family and setting the stage for its eventual improbable rise to European prominence. A quiet beginning to a rather loud future. With the Duchy of Prussia now firmly in the hands of the Hohenzollern family, albeit still as a Polish fief, the stage was set for a fascinating period of patient accumulation and strategic maneuvering that would slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, lay the groundwork for a truly formidable power. Imagine a chess grandmaster, not rushing to capture pieces, but meticulously positioning pawns and knights, anticipating moves far in advance, understanding that true power isn't built in a single, flashy move, but through consistent, incremental gains. This was the essence of Hohenzollerns' strategy, a dynastic ambition that spanned generations, focused on consolidating their scattered territories and incrementally enhancing their influence within the complex tapestry of the Holy Roman Empire and beyond. They weren't just content with their new duchy. They saw it as another stepping stone in a much larger game of territorial expansion and dynastic prestige, an opportunity to weave more threads into their already intricate tapestry of power. The Hohenzollerns were not newcomers to the political stage. They had already established a significant power base in Brandenburg, a large and strategically important principality within the Holy Roman Empire, with its capital at Berlin. Brandenburg itself had its own complex history, having been granted to the Hohenzollerns in 1415 by Emperor Sigismund as a reward for their loyalty, marking their formal entry into the upper echelons of German princely houses. This dual holding, Brandenburg in the heart of Germany and the Duchy of Prussia on the Baltic coast, created a geographically fragmented but strategically potent dynastic union. It was a bit like owning two separate, valuable properties that, while not physically connected, collectively enhanced the family's overall portfolio and influence, giving them leverage in different spheres of European politics. They were masters of inheritance and diplomacy, often marrying into other powerful families to secure future claims, or patiently waiting for opportunities to inherit territories when ruling lines died out without direct heirs, a rather polite form of territorial acquisition that avoided the messiness of outright war. The period following the secularization of Prussia in 1525 saw the Hohenzollerns focusing on internal consolidation and pragmatic governance within their existing domains. In Brandenburg, they worked to centralize administration, develop their economy, and build up their military, often navigating the tricky waters of religious divisions as the Reformation continued to reshape the political and social landscape of Germany. They skillfully managed the transition to Protestantism in Brandenburg, ensuring stability and avoiding the devastating religious wars that plagued other parts of the Holy Roman Empire, demonstrating a keen sense of political pragmatism over rigid ideological adherence. They understood that a stable, prosperous base was essential for any future expansion, and they applied this disciplined, efficient approach to both their Brandenburg and Prussian holdings. However, the real prize, the eventual union of these geographically disparate lands, was a long-term goal that required patience and a series of opportune events. The key moment arrived in the early 17th century, specifically in 1618, with the death of Albert Frederick, the last Duke of Prussia from the senior Hohenzollern line, who died without a male heir. This was the moment the Brandenburg Hohenzollerns had been anticipating and preparing for, a testament to their long-term strategic planning and their careful cultivation of marital alliances that had ensured their succession rights. Through a series of carefully arranged marriages and diplomatic maneuvers over the preceding decades, the electoral branch of the Hohenzollern family, ruling Brandenburg, had established a strong hereditary claim to the Duchy of Prussia. It's a bit like a corporate takeover bid that has been meticulously planned for generations, waiting for the perfect moment to execute. And so, in 1618, the Duchy of Prussia formally passed to John Sigismund, the Elector of Brandenburg, thus creating the personal union of Brandenburg-Prussia. This was not yet a unified state in the modern sense. The two entities remained legally distinct, with their own administrations, laws, and even their own feudal obligations. Prussia still owed homage to Poland, while Brandenburg was a direct vassal of the Holy Roman Emperor. However, they shared a common ruler, and this dynastic link was the crucial first step towards their eventual political and administrative integration. It was like two separate businesses being acquired by the same CEO, still operating independently, but now under a single, overarching leadership, with the potential for future synergy. This union immediately gave the Hohenzollerns a significantly larger territorial base, access to the Baltic seaports, and a dual identity that would allow them to play a more prominent role in both German and Eastern European affairs. The significance of this union cannot be overstated. It transformed the Hohenzollerns from a regional German power into a potential player on the European stage, uniting lands that possessed different strategic advantages and resources. Brandenburg brought a central German location and a seat in the Electoral College of the Holy Roman Empire, giving its ruler a voice in imperial affairs. Prussia, on the other hand, offered access to the lucrative Baltic trade routes and a more expansive, less densely populated territory ripe for development, albeit one with lingering feudal ties to Poland. This geographical spread, while presenting administrative challenges, also offered strategic depth and diverse economic opportunities, allowing the Hohenzollerns to pursue a more ambitious foreign policy. Historians still argue whether the initial motivations for the union were primarily defensive, seeking to secure Prussia from Polish or Swedish encroachment, or primarily expansionist, driven by a long-term Hohenzollern vision for a larger, more powerful state, leaving the precise blend of pragmatism and ambition a matter of scholarly debate. The long-term vision of the Hohenzollerns, however, remained constant: to eventually unify these disparate territories into a single, cohesive state, free from external obligations and powerful enough to dictate its own destiny. This ambition would drive their policies for the next 2 centuries, leading them to pursue a relentless policy of centralization, military expansion, and administrative reform, slowly eroding the distinctions between Brandenburg and Prussia, and forging them into a single, powerful entity. The patient, methodical accumulation of power, characteristic of the Hohenzollerns, had now yielded its most significant fruit yet: the union of Brandenburg and Prussia, setting the stage for the next tumultuous chapter in their rise. A chapter that would soon be overshadowed by one of Europe's most devastating conflicts. No sooner had the Brandenburg-Prussia Union been forged in 1618 than it was plunged into the crucible of the 30 Years' War, a conflict so utterly devastating that it reshaped the very fabric of Central Europe, leaving behind a landscape of ruin and a generation scarred by unprecedented brutality. Imagine pulling 2 fragile, newly connected pieces of ancient pottery into the middle of a medieval mosh pit. It was a miracle they didn't shatter completely. This wasn't just a local skirmish. It was a continent-wide maelstrom, fueled by religious animosity between Protestants and Catholics, dynastic rivalries, and the insatiable territorial ambitions of various European powers. For the young, fragmented state of Brandenburg-Prussia, it was less about grand strategic gains and more about sheer survival, navigating a tempest of marauding armies, widespread famine, and disease that swept through the land with terrifying efficiency. The Hohenzollern rulers, particularly George William, the Elector during much of the war, found themselves in an unenviable position, caught between the warring factions with a relatively weak army and an exposed geographic location. Brandenburg, being centrally located within the Holy Roman Empire, became a brutal highway for armies of all persuasions: Imperial, Swedish, Danish, Saxon, each one leaving behind a trail of destruction, plunder, and human misery. Imagine having an endless stream of unwelcome house guests, each more demanding and destructive than the last, refusing to leave and actively trashing your home. Prussia, being further east and still nominally a Polish fief, initially fared slightly better, shielded by its geographical remove and its formal neutrality. However, even it could not escape the indirect effects of the war, as trade routes were disrupted and the economic lifeblood of the region began to clot. The sheer scale of the devastation in Brandenburg was almost unfathomable. Villages were razed, farms abandoned, and entire towns depopulated, their inhabitants either killed, fled, or succumbed to the plague and famine that invariably followed the armies. It's hard for us to truly grasp the horror. Imagine walking through your neighborhood today and finding every third house burned to the ground, every second field barren, and the silence broken only by the wind whistling through empty windows. Contemporary accounts speak of rampant cannibalism in some of the most afflicted areas, a chilling testament to the depths of despair to which people were driven. The population of Brandenburg, by some estimates, may have been reduced by as much as 50% or even more in certain areas, a demographic catastrophe that would take generations to recover from. This demographic collapse had long-lasting economic and social consequences, as there simply weren't enough people to work the land or rebuild the infrastructure, hindering recovery for decades. This experience, however, forged a deep-seated conviction within the Hohenzollern leadership that a strong standing army was not a luxury, but an absolute necessity for the survival and protection of their state. They had witnessed firsthand the vulnerability of a weak state in a hostile world, learning the bitter lesson that neutrality without strength was merely an invitation for invasion. This wasn't just a strategic insight. It was a deeply ingrained trauma that would shape Prussian policy for centuries, becoming an almost genetic component of its state-building philosophy. The very notion that the army is the state, not the state the army, would eventually take root from these harrowing experiences, a direct ideological consequence of the relentless depredations suffered during the war. Despite the widespread destruction, the Hohenzollerns, with remarkable resilience, managed to make some strategic gains at the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, the treaties that finally brought the brutal conflict to an end. While not a triumphant victor, Brandenburg Prussia managed to acquire several new territories, including eastern Pomerania, previously under Swedish control, and the secularized bishoprics of Halberstadt and Minden, as well as the succession rights to the Archbishopric of Magdeburg. These acquisitions, while geographically disparate, further expanded the Hohenzollern landholdings and provided valuable resources, demonstrating their ability to leverage even weakness into opportunity. It was a testament to their diplomatic skill that they managed to emerge from such a devastating conflict with any gains at all. let alone significant ones. However, these new territories also brought new challenges. They were often war-torn, depopulated, and required significant investment and administrative effort to integrate them into the existing Brandenburg-Prussian framework. The task of rebuilding and consolidating these fragmented domains fell largely to the young Frederick William, who would later be known as the Great Elector, and who, having witnessed the chaos and vulnerability of his father's reign, was utterly determined to prevent such a catastrophe from ever befalling his lands again. This era of profound suffering, therefore, paradoxically served as a brutal, yet effective, school for the future leaders of Prussia, instilling in them a deep-seated commitment to military strength, fiscal prudence, and efficient administration, all born from the bitter ashes of the 30 Years' War. The war also highlighted the urgent need for a more centralized and efficient administration. The disparate nature of Brandenburg-Prussia's territories meant that governance was often piecemeal and ineffective, especially during wartime. The decentralized structure, with powerful local estates, hampered the elector's ability to raise taxes and troops effectively. This weakness became painfully apparent when foreign armies simply bypassed local authorities, leading to chaos. This realization would directly inform the Great Elector's later reforms, driving him to dismantle provincial autonomy and establish a more direct, unified state control. This experience cemented a desire for robust central authority, ensuring that the state could respond cohesively to future threats. Historians still argue whether the 30 Years' War's impact on Brandenburg-Prussia was solely destructive, or if its role in fostering a sense of shared vulnerability and a drive for centralized power ultimately laid a crucial foundation for the later rise of the Prussian state, making its long-term effects a subject of nuanced scholarly debate. The memories of this brutal conflict would linger in the Prussian psyche for generations, a constant reminder of the high cost of weakness and the indispensable value of military might. Emerging from the shattered landscape left by the 30 Years' War, a figure of immense resolve and vision took the reins of Brandenburg-Prussia. Frederick William, often revered as the Great Elector. If the war had been a brutal, unwanted inheritance, then Frederick William was the shrewd, determined executor who not only salvaged the estate, but began to systematically rebuild it, piece by painful piece, into something far stronger and more cohesive. Imagine a CEO taking over a company that's teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, riddled with debt and internal strife, and through sheer force of will and a relentless focus on efficiency, not only turns it around, but transforms it into an industry leader. That's the scale of his achievement. He had personally witnessed the chaos and devastation, the utter helplessness of a weak state, and he carried that lesson with him, burning brightly into every policy and reform he enacted. His entire reign from 1640 to 1688 was a masterclass in pragmatic state-building, laying the very foundations for the future Prussian monarchy. His most immediate and pressing concern was the establishment of a powerful, professional standing army, a stark contrast to the mercenary forces and hastily levied militias that had proven so ineffective during the war. He understood that in the cutthroat world of 17th century European politics, military strength was the ultimate guarantor of sovereignty and the primary tool for asserting influence. He wasn't just building an army for defense. He was building an army as the central pillar of the state, an institution that would demand resources, foster discipline, and ultimately bind the disparate territories of Brandenburg and Prussia together. He systematically raised taxes, often overriding the objections of the traditional provincial estates and nobility, to fund this ambitious military build-up. It was a tough sell, asking a war-weary population to contribute even more. But his unyielding determination eventually paid off, leading to a respectable force of around 45,000 men by the end of his reign. A remarkable achievement for a relatively small state. To support this burgeoning military and to simply govern his geographically scattered domains more effectively, Frederick William embarked on a series of radical administrative reforms designed to centralize power and bypass the often obstructive local assemblies and feudal privileges. He established a highly efficient bureaucratic apparatus staffed by educated and loyal officials, directly answerable to him. This involved creating the General War Commissariat, initially focused on army supply and finance, which gradually expanded its functions to become a comprehensive state administration, overseeing taxation, economic development, and civil affairs. This centralization was a direct challenge to the traditional powers of the nobility and the urban elites, who had long enjoyed considerable autonomy, a bit like a modern government stripping local councils of their ability to make their own decisions. He systematically undermined the power of the landage or provincial estates, replacing their fragmented authority with the uniform, centralized control of the Elector. Economically, Frederick William was a staunch proponent of mercantilism, a popular economic theory of the time that emphasized state control over the economy to maximize exports and accumulate wealth, primarily in the form of gold and silver. He understood that a strong army needed a strong economy to sustain it, and so he actively encouraged trade, industry, and agriculture within his domains. He promoted internal colonization, inviting skilled artisans and farmers to settle in his war-ravaged lands, even offering incentives to attract them. One of his most significant acts in this regard was the Edict of Potsdam in 1685, which offered refuge and economic incentives to the Huguenots, French Protestants, who were facing persecution after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Thousands of these skilled, industrious refugees poured into Brandenburg, bringing with them their crafts, capital, and work ethic, providing a massive boost to the Prussian economy, especially in areas like textile manufacturing and trade. It was a win-win, really. He gained a valuable, productive population, and they gained a safe haven, all while strengthening his state. His foreign policy was equally shrewd and pragmatic. Despite having a personal aversion to war, he used his growing military might to assert Brandenburg Prussia's interests on the European stage, often playing off rival powers against each other. He skillfully navigated the complex diplomacy of his era, recovering Pomerania from Swedish occupation, consolidating his hold over various territories, and constantly seeking to expand his influence. He demonstrated a remarkable ability to extract concessions and advantages from larger, more powerful neighbors, proving that even a state still recovering from devastation could wield significant diplomatic leverage with a well-trained army at its back. He made sure to project an image of strength and reliability, ensuring that when he spoke, other European monarchs listened, a significant departure from the vulnerability his state had experienced just decades prior. The great Elector also understood the importance of intellectual and cultural development, founding the University of Halle, a significant center for the Enlightenment in Germany, and promoting learning. He sought to create a state that was not only militarily strong, but also intellectually vibrant, understanding that true power encompassed more than just military might. This commitment to education and intellectual pursuits would become another hallmark of future Prussian rulers. Historians still argue whether Frederick William's reforms were purely authoritarian, driven by a desire for absolute power, or if they were a necessary, if harsh, response to the unique geopolitical vulnerabilities of Brandenburg Prussia, making the precise nature of his leadership a nuanced, scholarly debate. Regardless, his reign was a pivotal turning point, transforming a collection of battered, disparate territories into a formidable, centralized state, laying the indestructible foundation upon which the future kingdom of Prussia would be built, a kingdom that would emerge fully formed by the time his successor took the throne. As the 17th century drew to a close, the stage was meticulously set by the great Elector, Frederick William, for a momentous elevation in the status of Brandenburg Prussia, a transformation that would see it shed its ducal skin and emerge as a kingdom. This wasn't merely a cosmetic change of title. It was a profound shift in geopolitical standing, elevating the Hohenzollern ruler from a mere elector within the Holy Roman Empire to a sovereign monarch on the European stage, a status coveted by many but achieved by few. Imagine a successful startup, after years of diligent growth and strategic acquisitions, finally announcing its IPO and becoming a publicly traded behemoth. It's the moment of recognition, the signal that it has truly arrived. The man who would preside over this pivotal moment was Frederick William's son, Frederick III, who, while perhaps lacking the sheer gravitas and military genius of his father, possessed a keen understanding of prestige and the art of political maneuver. Frederick III, who would soon become Frederick I, king in Prussia, was a man of ambition, but his ambitions leaned more towards cultural splendor and aristocratic pomp than the Spartan military efficiency favored by his father. He loved lavish ceremonies, grand palaces, and the trappings of royalty, a stark contrast to his father's rather austere demeanor, which makes one wonder if he was perhaps trying to overcompensate for growing up under such a strict, no-nonsense parent. He understood that in the grand theater of 17th and 18th century Europe, outward displays of power and prestige were almost as important as military might. He keenly observed the rise of other European monarchies, like the Kingdom of Great Britain or the Kingdom of Sweden, and saw that the title of king conferred a level of diplomatic weight and recognition that an elector simply could not command. He desired to join this exclusive club, not just for personal vanity, but for the long-term benefit and prestige of the Hohenzollern dynasty. The path to kingship, however, was not straightforward. It required careful negotiation and political opportunism within the complex web of European power dynamics. The Holy Roman Emperor, Leopold I, was initially reluctant to grant such a prestigious title, fearing it would diminish his own authority and set a precedent for other ambitious princes within the empire. It was a bit like a seasoned old business owner being asked to give a junior partner a fancy new title that might make them seem like an equal. Not exactly keen on that. However, fate, or perhaps just astute Hohenzollern diplomacy, intervened in the form of the impending War of the Spanish Succession. This massive European conflict, which would redraw the map of power, created an opportunity for Frederick. The emperor desperately needed allies and troops to counter the formidable power of France and its Bourbon dynasty. Frederick seized this moment with characteristic Hohenzollern shrewdness, offering significant military support to the emperor's cause in exchange for the coveted royal title. It was a classic quid pro quo, a strategic bargain where military might was traded for political elevation. In a secret treaty signed in 1700, Emperor Leopold V agreed to recognize Frederick III as King in Prussia, a carefully worded title designed to appease various sensibilities. The in Prussia, rather than of Prussia, was a deliberate distinction. It acknowledged his sovereignty over the Duchy of Prussia, which lay outside the formal borders of the Holy Roman Empire, and was thus not directly subject to the emperor's feudal authority. This was a crucial legal loophole, allowing the emperor to grant a royal title without technically undermining his own imperial authority within the empire itself. It was a diplomatic fudge, but a highly effective one, allowing both parties to save face while achieving their respective goals. On January 18, 1701, in a magnificent ceremony held in Königsberg, the capital of the Duchy of Prussia, Frederick III crowned himself Frederick I, King in Prussia. This self-coronation was a symbolic act of defiance, emphasizing his sovereign authority and independence from both the emperor and the pope, a clear declaration that his kingship was not bestowed by external powers, but asserted by his own will and power. Imagine walking into your own promotion ceremony and then placing the crown on your own head. It sends a pretty strong message about who's in charge. This grand event was a display of lavish spectacle designed to impress and legitimize the new royal status, complete with elaborate robes, glittering jewels, and all the pomp and circumstance that Frederick so dearly loved, creating a stark contrast to the rough and ready militarism of his father. The significance of this elevation was immense. Overnight, Brandenburg, Prussia, was transformed into the Kingdom of Prussia, a recognized European monarchy. This gave the Hohenzollerns unprecedented prestige on the international stage, allowing them to engage in diplomacy as equals with other great powers. It also served to further integrate the disparate territories of Brandenburg and Prussia under a single, unified royal crown, slowly blurring the lines between them and fostering a stronger sense of shared identity under the new monarchy. While administrative distinctions still existed, the royal title provided a powerful centralizing force, an overarching symbol of unity and sovereign power that transcended regional differences. This new status attracted more talented individuals to serve the Prussian state, drawn by the prestige and opportunities offered by a rising kingdom. The new King Frederick I, despite his love for luxury and the arts, did not entirely neglect the military or administrative foundations laid by his father. He continued to maintain a respectable army, though he preferred to use it as a tool for diplomatic leverage rather than direct conflict, a prudent strategy for a new kingdom seeking to solidify its position. He invested in infrastructure, promoted education, and fostered a cultural flourishing that saw Berlin transformed into a more elegant and sophisticated capital. He was particularly keen on establishing academies and universities, recognizing the importance of intellectual pursuits for a modern state. This blending of military strength with cultural ambition, while perhaps not as focused as his father's singular pursuit of martial power, contributed to the overall development of the young kingdom. Historians still argue whether Frederick I's pursuit of kingship was primarily an act of personal vanity, or if it was a shrewd, far-sighted political move that proved essential for Prussia's long-term rise and recognition on the European stage, making his true motivations a fascinating, open, scholarly debate. Regardless of his personal inclinations, the formal establishment of the Kingdom of Prussia marked a critical turning point, signifying its arrival as a legitimate and aspiring power in Europe, a power that would soon be defined by the very different priorities of his successor. The grand, somewhat flamboyant reign of Frederick I, the first king in Prussia, was swiftly followed by a dramatic shift in royal temperament, a pendulum swing from lavish courtly life to an almost ascetic dedication to military might and fiscal austerity. This abrupt change was embodied by his son, Frederick William I, who ascended the throne in 1713 and would forever be known to history as the Soldier King. Imagine inheriting a sprawling, slightly disorganized estate where the previous owner loved collecting art and throwing elaborate parties, only to immediately fire all the entertainers, sell off the paintings, and convert the grand ballroom into a rigorous training ground. That was the essence of Frederick William I's approach, a man utterly devoid of artistic pretensions, but brimming with an almost obsessive zeal for military efficiency and a deeply ingrained, almost puritanical work ethic. He was, to put it mildly, not a fan of superfluous spending, especially when it didn't directly contribute to the strength of his beloved army, a trait that must have made court life a joy for everyone involved, especially the tailors. From the moment he took the crown, Frederick William I embarked on a relentless mission to transform Prussia into the most efficient and disciplined military state in Europe. He famously declared, "The army is the state, not the state the army," a maxim that perfectly encapsulated his philosophy and became the guiding principle of Prussian governance for generations. This wasn't just a catchy phrase. It was a deeply held conviction that every aspect of state administration, every fiscal decision, and every social policy should ultimately serve the purpose of supporting and strengthening the military. He slashed court expenses with a vengeance, dismissed most of the musicians and artists, and even melted down much of the royal plate to fund his military ambitions, making himself arguably the least popular monarch among the silverware sets in Europe. His personal life was equally Spartan. He lived modestly, dressed simply, and demanded the same rigorous discipline from his family and his court, often personally overseeing the training of his regiments and inspecting every detail of military life. His most enduring legacy was the creation of the Potsdam Giants, also known as the Lange Curls, or Tall Fellows, an elite regiment composed solely of exceptionally tall soldiers, often recruited from across Europe, sometimes by less than gentle persuasion. This regiment became a symbol of his military obsession and the peculiar pride he took in the physical prowess of his troops. While perhaps more a curiosity than a truly revolutionary military innovation, the Potsdam Giants underscored his personal involvement in the army and his almost fetishistic attention to its details. More importantly, he implemented a system of conscription known as the canton system, dividing Prussia into recruiting districts, cantons, each responsible for supplying a certain number of soldiers. This systematic approach ensured a steady supply of recruits, allowing for the rapid expansion of the army without relying heavily on expensive foreign mercenaries. A key component in building a truly national force. Beyond the visible manifestations of his military obsession, Frederick William I was a shrewd and effective administrator who understood that a strong army required a strong economic and administrative backbone. He continued and greatly expanded the administrative reforms initiated by the great Elector, further centralizing government and creating a highly efficient, professional bureaucracy. He introduced strict fiscal discipline, ensuring that state revenues were meticulously collected and wisely spent, primarily on the army. He standardized taxation, improved agricultural methods, and promoted internal colonization and manufacturing, all with the aim of increasing the state's economic capacity to support its military machine. He was relentless in his pursuit of efficiency, demanding absolute loyalty and diligence from his officials, often personally overseeing even minor administrative details, famously inspecting tax rolls and supply inventories himself, leaving very little room for bureaucratic shenanigans or slacking off. This intense focus on the army and efficient administration led to the development of a highly disciplined and well-trained Prussian officer corps, renowned throughout Europe for its professionalism and loyalty. The military ethos permeated Prussian society, fostering a sense of duty, obedience, and service to the state that became deeply ingrained in the national character. While his methods were often harsh, he was known for his explosive temper and his tendency to cane unruly officials or even members of his own family. His policies produced tangible results. By the end of his reign, Prussia possessed the fourth largest army in Europe, despite being only the 10th largest in terms of population and land area. A truly remarkable feat of state building and resource allocation. It was like a small country punching far above its weight class, all thanks to a king who understood that military might was the ultimate equalizer. Despite building such a formidable military, the soldier king was surprisingly reluctant to use it in major wars. He preferred to project power through deterrence, carefully avoiding costly conflicts and focusing instead on maintaining his army in peak condition. He was a master of diplomatic saber-rattling, using his military as leverage to secure favorable treaties and assert Prussia's interests without firing a shot, a strategic approach that preserved his precious resources. He famously stated that he wanted to be the most feared man in Europe through his army, but not necessarily through its deployment. This strategic prudence allowed Prussia to continue its internal consolidation and economic development, building up its strength for future generations. Historians still argue whether his aversion to large-scale warfare was a calculated strategic decision, aimed at preserving his meticulously built army, or a reflection of a personal caution that belied his gruff exterior, making his true motivations a subject of fascinating, open scholarly debate. His reign, though often overshadowed by the more dramatic exploits of his son, Frederick the Great, was arguably the most crucial period in the forging of the modern Prussian state. Frederick William II took the disparate, loosely connected territories of the Kingdom of Prussia and welded them into a cohesive, centralized, and militarily formidable entity, a state that was, quite literally, designed around its army. He cultivated a deep-seated tradition of duty, efficiency, and self-sacrifice that became the hallmark of Prussian identity. He left his successor not a treasury overflowing with gold, but something far more valuable, a perfectly honed military instrument and a state apparatus uniquely geared to support it, poised to shake the foundations of Europe, proving that sometimes the quietest reins can lay the loudest groundwork. From the austere, barracks-like world shaped by the soldier king, Frederick William I, emerged a figure who would shatter all expectations, transforming the militarily potent but culturally provincial Kingdom of Prussia into a major European power, a beacon of Enlightenment thought, and a legendary figure in his own right. Frederick II, universally known as Frederick the Great. Imagine being raised by a drill sergeant of a father, constantly told to conform, to be practical, to focus only on military matters, only for you to secretly devour philosophical texts, compose music, and correspond with the greatest thinkers of your age, all while plotting your escape from your father's rigid grip. This was the youthful paradox of Frederick, a brilliant and complex individual whose early life was a constant clash between his artistic and intellectual inclinations and his father's harsh, unyielding demands, a struggle that would deeply shape his character and his reign. Born in 1712, Frederick's childhood was far from idyllic. It was a grueling regimen dictated by his father's obsession with military training and Spartan discipline. Frederick William Thunce saw little value in the arts, philosophy, or anything that didn't directly contribute to the strength of the state, famously referring to his son's flute as a German flute, a rather scornful term in his eyes. He subjected young Frederick to a rigorous military education, drills, and constant criticism, often resorting to physical and emotional abuse to break his son's perceived effeminacy and force him into the mold of a dutiful soldier prince. It was a relentless attempt to pound the square peg into a round hole, with predictably disastrous short-term results for their relationship. Frederick, however, possessed an iron will of his own, and while he outwardly conformed to his father's demands, he secretly pursued his passions for French literature, music — he was an accomplished flutist and composer — and philosophy, corresponding with leading Enlightenment figures like Voltaire, often under pseudonyms, to avoid his father's wrath. This intellectual rebellion culminated in a desperate, ill-fated attempt by Frederick, at the age of 18, to flee Prussia with his close friend and alleged lover, Hans Hermann von Katter, in 1730. The escape attempt was discovered, leading to a brutal and humiliating punishment orchestrated by his father. Katter was arrested, tried for desertion, and despite Frederick's fervent pleas, was executed directly in front of Frederick's prison window, a horrifying spectacle designed to break his son's spirit and instill absolute obedience. Frederick himself was imprisoned and almost faced execution, saved only by the intervention of Emperor Charles VI. This traumatic event had a profound impact on Frederick, hardening his resolve, teaching him the harsh realities of power, and forcing him to suppress his more sensitive, artistic side in favor of a pragmatic, ruthless pursuit of statecraft. He learned that sentiment had no place in the corridors of power, a bitter lesson carved into his very soul. Following this ordeal, Frederick gradually reconciled with his father, outwardly embracing the military and administrative training that had been forced upon him. He immersed himself in the practicalities of governance, serving as an administrator and gaining invaluable experience in state affairs. He commanded a regiment, studied military tactics, and began to develop his own strategic theories, demonstrating a keen intellect and a surprising aptitude for the very things he had once resisted. This period of forced apprenticeship, while painful, allowed him to gain a deep understanding of the Prussian state machine, its strengths and its weaknesses, knowledge that would prove indispensable in his future reign. He learned how to manage resources, motivate troops, and navigate the intricate hierarchies of the Prussian bureaucracy, proving himself a quick study in the art of rule. When Frederick William Thus died in 1740, the unlikely intellectual prince, Frederick II, ascended to the Prussian throne, inheriting a remarkably well-oiled machine, a full treasury, a highly disciplined and formidable army, and an efficient, centralized administration. He also inherited his father's strict work ethic, waking before dawn, working tirelessly, and demanding the same from his subordinates, though he tempered it with his own distinct brand of enlightened thought. The stage was set for him to prove whether his intellectual pursuits had made him a weak monarch, as his father had feared, or whether they had sharpened his mind to become a truly transformative leader. He was now free to implement his own vision, a vision that combined the Prussian military discipline with the progressive ideals of the Enlightenment, a unique blend that would define his reign. Frederick immediately made clear that he was a different kind of ruler. He recalled the philosopher Christian Wolff, who had been banished by his father, and invited Voltaire to his court, surrounding himself with intellectuals and artists, transforming the rigid court into a salon of ideas. Yet, beneath this veneer of enlightened liberalism lay a steely ambition and a willingness to use the formidable military apparatus he had inherited. He quickly proved that his philosophical leanings did not diminish his capacity for ruthless political action. In fact, they sharpened it. He was a master of strategic thinking, combining a deep knowledge of history and theory with a pragmatic understanding of realpolitik. Historians still argue whether Frederick's early philosophical inclinations were genuinely held ideals that were later tempered by the harsh realities of power, or if they were always subservient to his core ambition for Prussian aggrandizement, making the precise nature of his enlightenment a fascinating, open, scholarly debate. Regardless, the intellectual monarch was about to unleash the military might that his father had so meticulously built, throwing Europe into a series of conflicts that would fundamentally reshape its political landscape. The moment Frederick II ascended the Prussian throne in 1740, inheriting his father's meticulously crafted, though unused military machine, he wasted no time in unleashing its formidable power, plunging Europe into a series of brutal conflicts that would define his reign and solidify Prussia's place as a major continental player. It's almost as if he'd been handed a brand new, incredibly powerful sports car after years of only being allowed to look at it. And his first instinct was to immediately put the pedal to the metal, consequences be damned. His initial target was the prosperous, strategically vital Austrian province of Silesia, a rich industrial and agricultural region bordering Brandenburg. The timing was, from Frederick's perspective, impeccably opportune. The death of Emperor Charles VI had triggered the War of the Austrian Succession, throwing the Habsburg monarchy into disarray with the ascension of the young and inexperienced Maria Theresa. Historians still argue whether Frederick's sudden invasion of Silesia was a long-meditated plan for Prussian expansion or a quick, opportunistic strike to exploit Austrian weakness. But his actions certainly suggested a bold, premeditated ambition. Maria Theresa, a woman of formidable will but lacking immediate military resources, found herself facing a direct challenge to her inheritance. A challenge that Frederick, ever the pragmatist, saw as a golden opportunity to expand Prussian territory and prestige. He claimed ancient Hohenzollern rights to parts of Silesia, a rather flimsy legal pretext, but one that served to justify his aggressive move on the international stage. His real motive, however, was pure realpolitik: to seize a valuable province that would significantly increase Prussia's population, industrial capacity, and strategic depth, a direct challenge to the long-standing Habsburg dominance in Central Europe. In December 1740, just months after his coronation, Frederick launched his army into Silesia, initiating the First Silesian War. The speed and efficiency of the Prussian advance caught Austria completely by surprise. The well-drilled Prussian army, a testament to Frederick William III's relentless efforts, proved its mettle, showcasing its superior training and discipline against the more traditional Austrian forces. Frederick himself, though lacking extensive combat experience, demonstrated an eagerness to learn and a remarkable capacity for strategic thinking, personally leading his troops and quickly adapting to the realities of warfare. Imagine a brilliant theoretical physicist suddenly having to build a rocket on the fly, and against all odds, it actually takes off. The Prussian tactics, emphasizing rapid maneuvers and decisive engagements, quickly overwhelmed Austrian resistance, securing control over much of the province. The First Silesian War was relatively short but decisive, ending in 1742 with the Treaty of Berlin, which forced Austria to cede most of Silesia to Prussia. This was a monumental victory for Frederick and a clear signal to Europe that a new power had arrived. It was not, however, a lasting peace. Maria Theresa, deeply humiliated by the loss of Silesia and determined to regain her ancestral lands, secretly plotted her revenge, and the complex web of European alliances soon dragged Prussia back into conflict. Sure enough, in 1744, during the larger War of the Austrian Succession, Frederick intervened again, launching the Second Silesian War. This time, Austria was better prepared, and the fighting was fiercer. But the Prussian military, under Frederick's increasingly confident leadership, again proved superior, culminating in another decisive victory at the Battle of Kesselsdorf in 1745. The Treaty of Dresden, signed in the same year, reaffirmed Prussia's possession of Silesia, cementing its new territorial gains. These early Silesian wars had profound consequences, both for Prussia and for the broader European balance of power. For Prussia, the acquisition of Silesia was a game-changer. It nearly doubled the kingdom's population, added a wealthy industrial base, and significantly increased its tax revenues, providing the resources necessary to maintain and further expand its already formidable army. It transformed Prussia from a regional power into a recognized European power, capable of challenging the established order. For Frederick, these victories solidified his reputation as a brilliant military commander and a shrewd, if ruthless, statesman. He had taken a calculated risk and it had paid off handsomely, validating his belief that military aggression was sometimes necessary for national aggrandizement. However, these wars also created a deep and lasting animosity with Austria, fueling a rivalry that would dominate Central European politics for over a century. Maria Theresa never truly accepted the loss of Silesia, and her unwavering determination to reclaim it would lead to an even larger, more brutal conflict just a few years later. The Silesian Wars were not just about land. They were about prestige, dynastic honor, and the shifting power dynamics in an increasingly competitive European landscape. They demonstrated that Frederick the Great was not merely an enlightened philosopher king, but a man of action, willing to shed blood to achieve his ambitious goals. A dual nature that both fascinated and terrified his contemporaries. The acquisition of Silesia, therefore, became the cornerstone of Prussian power, providing the economic and demographic base that would allow Frederick to undertake even grander, more perilous ventures, setting the stage for the ultimate test of his reign. The uneasy peace following the Second Silesian War was, for all intents and purposes, merely a tense intermission before the main act, a period of furious diplomatic maneuvering that ultimately coalesced into one of the most widespread and devastating conflicts of the 18th century, the 7 Years' War. Imagine the entire continent of Europe as a powder keg, and Frederick the Great, with his ambitious land grabs, had just tossed in a handful of lit matches. Maria Theresa of Austria, still smarting from the loss of Silesia and absolutely determined to reclaim it, orchestrated a diplomatic revolution that fundamentally reshaped the traditional European alliances. For centuries, the Habsburgs and Bourbons, Austria and France, had been bitter rivals, almost like two grumpy old neighbors constantly feuding over property lines. Now, in a truly shocking turn, they buried the hatchet and formed an alliance, an unprecedented reversal that sent shivers down the spines of other European powers. This new coalition, which also included Russia, Sweden, and Saxony, effectively isolated Prussia, leaving it facing an overwhelming combination of formidable enemies on all sides. Frederick found himself in an impossible position, surrounded by vastly superior forces, with enemies to his west, south, and east, poised to dismember his hard-won kingdom. It was a situation that would have broken a lesser man. But Frederick, ever the audacious gambler, decided that offense was the best, perhaps only, defense. He launched a preemptive strike in August 1756, invading Saxony, a neutral state, with the intention of using it as a base for operations and preventing its forces from joining the Austrian alliance. This aggressive move, while strategically sound from his perspective, further alienated international opinion and cemented his image as an unpredictable and dangerous aggressor. His actions practically screamed, "If you're coming for me, I'm coming for you first, and I might just take your couch on the way." The 7 Years' War, which lasted from 1756 to 1763, was a brutal, attritional struggle that pushed Prussia to the absolute brink of collapse. Frederick, a military genius, repeatedly faced overwhelming numerical superiority, often fighting battles on multiple fronts simultaneously. His strategies were audacious, his maneuvers brilliant, and his personal courage in battle legendary. He achieved stunning victories against all odds, most notably at the Battle of Rossbach in 1757, where a smaller Prussian force decisively routed a combined French and Imperial army. And just a month later, at the Battle of Leuthen, where he inflicted a crushing defeat on the Austrians, showcasing his tactical brilliance and the unparalleled discipline of his troops. These victories, against such powerful adversaries, cemented his reputation as one of the greatest military commanders in history, inspiring awe and fear in equal measure across Europe. However, these triumphs came at an immense cost. Prussia, with its relatively small population and limited resources compared to its combined enemies, was bleeding profusely. Despite Frederick's strategic genius, the sheer weight of numbers eventually began to tell. The Prussians suffered devastating defeats, such as the Battle of Kunersdorf in 1759, where a combined Russian and Austrian force annihilated a significant portion of his army, leaving him on the verge of abdication and even contemplating suicide. Imagine being a chess master, brilliantly executing a series of moves, only to find your opponent has an endless supply of pawns and just keeps throwing them at you until you're overwhelmed. The war ravaged Prussian lands, disrupted its economy, and led to immense loss of life, pushing the state to its absolute limits of endurance. The survival of Prussia during these dark years often hung by a thread, and it was ultimately saved less by military prowess and more by a stroke of sheer improbable luck, often referred to as the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. In January 1762, Empress Elizabeth of Russia, a staunch enemy of Frederick, died suddenly. Her successor, Peter III, was a fervent admirer of Frederick the Great and immediately withdrew Russia from the war, even signing an alliance with Prussia and offering military aid. This unexpected turn of events relieved immense pressure on Prussia's eastern front, allowing Frederick to concentrate his forces against Austria and France, a lifeline thrown to a drowning man at the very last moment. Had Peter III not been such a fanboy, or had Elizabeth lived just a few more months, Prussia would likely have been carved up among its enemies. The Treaty of Hubertusburg in 1763 finally brought the war to an end for Prussia. Despite years of brutal fighting and immense casualties, the territorial status quo was largely restored. Prussia retained Silesia, and the other powers kept their pre-war borders. For Frederick, simply surviving and retaining Silesia was a colossal victory, a testament to his resilience and the strength of the state his father had built. He had faced down 3 major European powers simultaneously and emerged, battered but intact, having secured his most prized possession. The war solidified Prussia's position as a major European power, one that could not be ignored and one that had proven its military might against overwhelming odds. It was a moment of profound national pride, etching the image of Frederick the Great as the defender of the fatherland into the Prussian psyche. The war's legacy for Prussia was complex. While confirming its status, it also left the country exhausted, depopulated, and economically devastated. Frederick, now truly the Great, turned his attention to rebuilding his shattered kingdom, applying the same relentless energy he had shown in war to the tasks of administration and reform. The experience of fighting for survival further reinforced the Prussian focus on military efficiency and a centralized, highly disciplined state. Lessons learned through hardship. Historians still argue whether the high cost of the 7 Years' War, in terms of human lives and economic devastation, truly justified the retention of Silesia, or if it pushed Prussia onto an unsustainable path of militarism, making the ultimate strategic wisdom of the conflict a complex and open scholarly debate. However, one thing was clear. Frederick the Great had ensured that Prussia would never again be considered a minor player on the European stage. Having navigated the tempest of the 7 Years' War and emerged against all odds with Silesia still firmly in Prussian hands, Frederick the Great now turned his formidable intellect and relentless energy to the daunting task of rebuilding his shattered kingdom, ushering in a period often characterized as enlightened absolutism. Imagine a brilliant but stern headmaster having just overseen a grueling high-stakes exam, now dedicating himself to meticulously reorganizing the entire school, updating its curriculum, and ensuring every single student and faculty member is performing at peak efficiency, all while maintaining absolute control over every decision. This was Frederick's post-war approach, a blend of top-down authoritarian rule tempered by a genuine commitment to reason, progress, and the welfare of his subjects, at least as he defined it. He was, after all, the man who famously described himself as the first servant of the state, a subtle but significant departure from the traditional divine right of kings. Frederick's philosophy of governance was deeply influenced by the Enlightenment, but it was an enlightenment filtered through a distinctly Prussian lens, blending rational thought with an unwavering belief in centralized power and military strength. He corresponded with leading philosophers like Voltaire, read widely, and considered himself a patron of the arts and sciences. Yet he held firmly to the reins of absolute power, believing that only a strong, unified monarchy could guide the state effectively. He didn't believe in democratic participation or individual liberties in the modern sense. Rather, he believed that the monarch, guided by reason and serving the state, was best equipped to ensure the prosperity and stability of his subjects. It was a benevolent dictatorship, perhaps, but a dictatorship nonetheless. He saw the state as a single, complex machine, and himself as the skilled mechanic, constantly tinkering and optimizing its various parts for maximum performance. His domestic reforms after the war were extensive and wide-ranging, demonstrating his comprehensive vision for a stronger Prussia. Economically, he continued to pursue mercantilist policies, actively promoting trade, industry, and agriculture to replenish the state's coffers and support its large army. He invested heavily in draining swamps, cultivating new lands, and improving existing agricultural methods, famously introducing the potato to Prussia as a staple crop to prevent future famines, a move that perhaps earned him more lasting culinary gratitude than military renown. He established state-run manufactories, particularly in textiles and porcelain, and encouraged foreign immigration, especially skilled artisans and farmers, to repopulate his devastated lands, showing a pragmatic understanding that human capital was as vital as financial capital. In the realm of justice, Frederick initiated significant reforms aimed at creating a more efficient and equitable legal system, at least in theory. He ordered the codification of Prussian law, a monumental undertaking that resulted in the Corpus Juris Fridericianum, a comprehensive legal code designed to be clear, consistent, and accessible. He abolished torture, a barbaric practice still common in much of Europe, and sought to reduce corruption within the judiciary, famously intervening in cases where he perceived injustice, even if it meant challenging powerful nobles. Imagine a king personally handling customer service complaints about the legal system. It certainly sent a message about who was in charge and that justice, or his version of it, was paramount. He believed that a just and predictable legal system was essential for a stable society and a productive economy. Education also received his attention, though his reforms here were perhaps less revolutionary than in other areas. He promoted the establishment of elementary schools and supported academies and universities, recognizing the importance of an educated populace for a modern state, particularly for its burgeoning bureaucracy and military. He sought to create a more meritocratic system, at least within the civil service and the army officer corps, where talent and service, rather than solely birth, could lead to advancement. Though this was still a slow and often challenging process against entrenched aristocratic privilege. He famously quipped that all religions are tolerated, but everyone must pay taxes, reflecting his pragmatic approach to religious diversity within his kingdom, seeing it as an economic asset rather than a cause for strife. However, it is crucial to remember the absolutism in enlightened absolutism. Frederick remained an undisputed monarch, making all major decisions himself, consulting advisors, but ultimately ruling by decree. While he promoted intellectual discourse and sought to improve the lives of his subjects, he did not tolerate dissent or challenge to his authority. Freedom of the press was limited, and political participation remained non-existent. The burgeoning middle class and the vast peasantry had little say in governance, reflecting the inherent tension between enlightened ideals and the maintenance of an autocratic state. He maintained a strong secret police and surveillance apparatus, demonstrating that even an enlightened ruler was deeply wary of popular unrest. The legacy of Frederick's post-war reforms was profound. He solidified Prussia's administrative efficiency, further integrating its diverse territories under a centralized state apparatus, and fostered an enduring culture of bureaucratic competence and military discipline that would define Prussia for generations. He had taken a war-torn kingdom, and through sheer force of will and a relentless commitment to what he believed was rational governance, rebuilt it, stronger and more resilient than before. His reign cemented the idea of the state as a single, unified entity, with the monarch as its chief steward, rather than a collection of feudal privileges. This model of efficient, centralized governance, coupled with a powerful military, became the hallmark of the Prussian system and would prove instrumental in its future expansion and its role in shaping the destiny of Germany. Historians still argue whether Frederick's enlightened reforms were truly beneficial for all segments of Prussian society, or if they primarily served to strengthen the state apparatus and the ruling class at the expense of genuine popular empowerment, making the long-term social impact of his policies a subject of ongoing, fascinating scholarly debate. Even as Frederick the Great meticulously rebuilt and reformed his kingdom through the principles of enlightened absolutism, his strategic gaze remained fixed on the shifting geopolitical landscape of Eastern Europe, always alert for opportunities to expand Prussia's power and territory. Imagine a meticulous gardener tending to his prize-winning roses, but always with one eye on his neighbor's yard, wondering if there's a new patch of fertile ground he might acquire. This constant vigilance led Prussia, along with its erstwhile rival Austria and the rising power of Russia to engage in one of the most cynical and morally dubious acts of 18th century diplomacy, the Partitions of Poland. This wasn't a war of conquest in the traditional sense, but rather a cold, calculated dismemberment of a sovereign nation, driven by pure self-interest and a shocking disregard for international norms. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, once a vast and powerful state, had by the mid-18th century fallen into a state of severe internal weakness. Its unique political system, characterized by a weak central monarchy and the liberum veto, a parliamentary device that allowed any single member of the Sejm, or parliament, to unilaterally block legislation, had led to chronic political paralysis, making it ripe for exploitation by its more powerful and autocratic neighbors. It was like a giant, rich pie with no one really in charge of cutting it. So naturally, the neighbors decided to bring their own knives. Russia, under the ambitious Catherine the Great, exerted immense influence over Polish affairs, effectively treating it as a protectorate, while Prussia and Austria harbored their own long-standing territorial ambitions on Poland's western and southern borders. The stage was set for a predatory feast, with Poland as the unwilling main course. Frederick the Great, ever the pragmatist, saw Poland's weakness as an irresistible opportunity to connect his disconnected territories and further enhance Prussia's strategic position. The 7 Years' War had demonstrated the vulnerability of his geographically fragmented kingdom, with Brandenburg separated from East Prussia by Polish territory. Acquiring a strip of land to bridge this gap would solidify his kingdom and provide vital trade routes to the Baltic Sea. He was a master of identifying strategic necessities and then finding the means, however unscrupulous, to achieve them. For him, the partitions were not about ideology or religion, but about pure raison d'etat, the interests of the state above all else. The first partition of Poland in 1772, was largely orchestrated by Frederick the Great himself, who skillfully played on the mutual suspicions and ambitions of Russia and Austria. He recognized that a unilateral move would likely trigger a wider conflict, but a coordinated effort, where each power received a slice of the Polish pie, would be mutually beneficial and thus more likely to succeed. He proposed a plan to Catherine the Great and Maria Theresa, arguing that partitioning parts of Poland would prevent a larger European war over the Polish question and satisfy their respective territorial appetites. It was a classic. If you can't beat 'em, join 'em, and then carve up the third-party strategy. Under the terms of the first partition, Prussia acquired Royal Prussia, minus the city of Danzig and Thorn, a highly significant gain. This acquisition, which Frederick shrewdly renamed West Prussia, finally connected Brandenburg with East Prussia, creating a continuous territorial link that had long been a strategic aspiration for the Hohenzollerns. It was like finally connecting two pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that had frustratingly remained separate for centuries. This new territory was rich in agriculture, particularly grain, and provided access to the valuable Vistula River trade, significantly boosting Prussia's economic resources and strategic depth. Austria, for its part, gained Galicia, a rich agricultural and salt-producing region, while Russia took a large slice of Belarus and Livonia, effectively pushing its western borders further into Europe. The first partition was a diplomatic coup for Frederick, achieved without firing a shot, consolidating his kingdom and significantly increasing its resources. However, it set a dangerous precedent, demonstrating that powerful nations could simply carve up weaker ones without consequence. A grim harbinger for international law and sovereignty. Despite the outrage expressed by some Enlightenment thinkers, the pragmatic realities of power politics prevailed. This act revealed the darker side of enlightened absolutism, a rational calculation of state interest that could, at times, override moral considerations. 2 more partitions would follow after Frederick's death, though Prussia played a less central role in orchestrating them. The second partition in 1793 saw Prussia gain more Polish territory, including the cities of Danzig and Thorn, as Russia and Prussia intervened to crush Polish attempts at internal reform and a more centralized constitution, fearing a revitalized Poland. The third partition in 1795 involved all 3 powers, leading to the complete disappearance of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth from the map of Europe for over a century, its remaining territories swallowed up by Russia, Austria, and Prussia. Prussia gained significant portions of central Poland, including Warsaw, effectively doubling its Slavic population and pushing its borders further east. The partitions of Poland solidified Prussia's geographical position and greatly enhanced its size and resources, but they also added a large, predominantly Catholic Polish population to its already ethnically diverse kingdom, creating new administrative and cultural challenges for the largely Protestant, German-speaking state. These acquisitions further cemented Prussia's position as a dominant power in Central and Eastern Europe. But the ethical stain of the partitions would remain a controversial aspect of its history. Historians still argue whether the partitions were an inevitable outcome of Poland's internal weaknesses, or if they were a deliberate act of cynical aggression by the 3 great powers, making the precise balance of Polish culpability and external predatory behavior a subject of enduring and often passionate scholarly debate. Regardless, these acts of territorial acquisition, achieved through cold, calculated diplomacy rather than direct military conquest, marked the final great expansion of Frederick the Great's Prussia, leaving his successor a larger, more powerful, but also more complex kingdom, poised on the precipice of a new era of European upheaval. The death of Frederick the Great in 1786 marked the end of an era, a golden age for Prussia, and ushered in a period of gradual decline and ultimately profound humiliation at the hands of a new, revolutionary force sweeping across Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte. Imagine a meticulously crafted, highly efficient, but somewhat aging grand machine, designed for a specific kind of warfare and diplomacy, suddenly facing a hypermodern, dynamic, and utterly ruthless adversary who simply doesn't play by the old rules. Prussia, under Frederick's less capable successors, found itself ill-prepared for the seismic shifts unleashed by the French Revolution and the subsequent rise of Napoleon, a period that would shatter the old European order and leave the once proud Prussian military and state reeling. Frederick William II, who succeeded his uncle Frederick the Great, lacked his predecessor's strategic genius and unwavering work ethic. He was more interested in mysticism and maintaining the courtly splendor that Frederick the Great had largely abandoned. His reign saw a relaxation of the stringent administrative discipline that had been the hallmark of Prussian governance, leading to a creeping inefficiency and a less focused foreign policy. Prussia, lulled by its past glories and the perceived strength of its army, became complacent, failing to adapt to the revolutionary changes in military organization and tactics pioneered by France. It was like a once dominant company that rested on its laurels, ignoring emerging technologies and innovative competitors, only to find itself rapidly outmaneuvered. The early years of the French Revolutionary Wars saw Prussia adopt a cautious, often indecisive policy, participating in coalitions against France, but often withdrawing prematurely or acting with limited commitment. The Prussian army, once the envy of Europe, had become ossified, its leadership dominated by aging, aristocratic generals who clung to the tactics and training methods of Frederick the Great's era, utterly blind to the fundamental transformations occurring in French military doctrine. Napoleon's armies, driven by revolutionary fervor, utilizing mass conscription and employing dynamic, rapid maneuvers, represented a completely new paradigm of warfare, one that the Prussian military, stuck in its parade ground precision, was ill-equipped to counter. They still expected their enemies to stand in neat lines and wait to be shot, a rather quaint notion by the turn of the 19th century. The full extent of Prussia's decline and its unpreparedness for the new age of warfare became brutally apparent in 1806, when Napoleon, after his victories against Austria and Russia, turned his attention to Prussia. Frederick William III, who had succeeded his father in 1797, was a well-intentioned but timid and indecisive ruler, often paralyzed by fear and conflicting advice. Despite some internal pressure to reform, he hesitated to confront Napoleon, clinging to a policy of neutrality that ultimately proved futile. Napoleon, seeing through Prussia's weak resolve, provoked a conflict, and the result was nothing short of catastrophic for the proud Prussian military. In a stunning double defeat, on October 14, 1806, the main Prussian armies were utterly annihilated at the battles of Jena and Auerstedt. At Jena, Napoleon personally crushed the forces under Prince Hohenlohe, while Marshal Davout, with a smaller force, achieved an even more remarkable victory over the main Prussian army commanded by the Duke of Brunswick at Auerstedt. It was an astonishing display of French military superiority and Prussian strategic and tactical incompetence. Imagine one day your national football team, which has always been a champion, suddenly loses two major matches on the same day by humiliating scores. It was that kind of national shock and despair. The famous Prussian discipline and precision, once its greatest strength, became its undoing, as its rigid formations were outmaneuvered and shattered by the fluid, aggressive French attacks. The aftermath was even more humiliating. Napoleon's Grande Armée swept through Prussia, occupying Berlin, the capital, and virtually disbanding the remaining Prussian forces. The royal family fled, and the entire kingdom lay prostrate before the French emperor. The Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, dictated by Napoleon, was a draconian peace that stripped Prussia of nearly half its territory, including all its lands west of the Elbe River, and its gains from the Partitions of Poland. Prussia was reduced to a second-rate power, forced to pay massive indemnities, and compelled to limit its army to a mere 42,000 men. It was forced to join Napoleon's continental system, which aimed to cripple British trade, and its national pride was utterly shattered. The image of the triumphant French emperor riding through the Brandenburg Gate, a symbol of Prussian power, was a stark and painful reminder of its abject defeat. The humiliation of 1806–1807 was a deep national trauma for Prussia, forcing a painful reckoning with its weaknesses and failures. It shattered the illusion of Prussian military invincibility, a legacy of Frederick the Great, and exposed the profound need for radical change. This period of occupation and subjugation, however, paradoxically became the catalyst for a period of intense and far-reaching Prussian reforms, driven by a new generation of far-sighted statesmen and military leaders who understood that the old ways were dead and that only fundamental change could save the state from oblivion. Historians still argue whether the scale of the Prussian defeat was solely due to their military's outdated tactics, or if the deeper issue lay in a general governmental inertia and a lack of decisive leadership, making the specific causes of their collapse a complex and open scholarly debate. Nevertheless, the bitter taste of defeat and the ignominy of occupation proved to be a powerful, albeit harsh, stimulant for renewal, setting the stage for Prussia's improbable national revival. The profound humiliation of the Napoleonic defeats at Jena and Auerstedt, and the subsequent dictated Peace of Tilsit, acted as a searing crucible for Prussia, burning away the complacency and exposing the deep-seated flaws that had led to its near annihilation. This period of national catastrophe, however, paradoxically ignited a remarkable and far-reaching program of Prussian reforms, a desperate yet ultimately transformative effort to fundamentally rebuild the state from its foundations upwards. Imagine a once proud, well-funded company brought to its knees by a market disruption, forced to completely reevaluate its business model, streamline its operations, and invest in innovation just to survive, recognizing that clinging to past glory would guarantee its demise. This was Prussia's moment of radical self-correction, driven by a new generation of brilliant, often idealistic, reformers. These reformers, who emerged from the military, civil service, and intellectual circles, shared a common conviction that Prussia's survival depended on a complete overhaul of its antiquated institutions, drawing inspiration from the very revolutionary principles that had given Napoleon his strength, but adapting them to a distinctly Prussian context. They recognized that the old, rigid, aristocratic system was no longer viable, and that a stronger, more resilient state required the broader participation and loyalty of its populace. This wasn't about liberal democracy in the modern sense. It was about creating a more efficient, meritocratic, and nationally conscious state, capable of resisting external threats and asserting its independence. At the forefront of the military reforms was Gerhard von Scharnhorst and August von Gneisenau, two visionary generals who understood that the old aristocratic long-service army was utterly obsolete against Napoleon's mass conscript armies driven by patriotic fervor. They initiated radical changes aimed at creating a modern national army. They abolished the brutal corporal punishments that had long characterized Prussian military life, improving soldier morale and attracting better recruits. Crucially, they introduced the principle of universal conscription, though initially disguised as a Krumper system to circumvent Napoleon's troop limits, meaning that all able-bodied men were liable for military service, creating a large reserve force that could be quickly mobilized. This was a revolutionary concept for Prussia, shifting the burden of defense from a professional standing army to the entire citizenry, fostering a new sense of national duty and shared sacrifice. They reformed the officer corps, opening it to talent regardless of aristocratic birth, emphasizing merit and education over noble lineage, effectively creating a professional military leadership dedicated to strategic thought and innovation. Parallel to the military reforms were the profound civil reforms, spearheaded primarily by statesmen like Karl August von Hardenberg and Heinrich Friedrich Karl vom und zum Stein. These reforms aimed at dismantling the feudal structures that still stifled economic growth and social mobility. Stein's Edict of Emancipation in 1807 abolished serfdom, freeing the peasantry from their hereditary bondage to the land and their feudal lords. While the implementation was slow and sometimes problematic for the former serfs, who often gained little land, it was a crucial step towards creating a free labor force and fostering greater individual liberty, at least legally. Imagine telling generations of people that suddenly they're not tied to the land they've always worked. It was a societal earthquake, albeit a slow-motion one. Hardenberg further pushed for economic liberalization, advocating for free trade, abolishing guilds, and reforming the tax system to be more equitable and efficient. These economic reforms were designed to stimulate commerce, industry, and agriculture, unleashing the productive forces of the nation to create wealth that could sustain the state and its military. They privatized state lands and encouraged agricultural innovation, recognizing that a prosperous economy was the bedrock of national power. This was a far cry from the paternalistic mercantilism of earlier Prussian rulers. It was a more liberal, market-oriented approach, albeit one still guided by state imperatives. The administrative reforms sought to centralize and rationalize the state bureaucracy, creating a more efficient and accountable government. The old, fragmented provincial administrations were replaced by a more unified system, and a professional, merit-based civil service was established. This meant that talented individuals, regardless of their social background, could rise through the ranks of government, contributing their skills to the state. Educational reforms, spearheaded by figures like Wilhelm von Humboldt, led to the founding of the University of Berlin, now Humboldt University, in 1810, which quickly became a leading center of scholarship and intellectual inquiry, emphasizing research and academic freedom. This was not just about producing skilled bureaucrats and officers. It was about fostering a national consciousness, a sense of shared German identity, and a commitment to the Prussian state that transcended regional loyalties. These Prussian reforms were not merely tactical adjustments. They were a profound shift in the nature of the Prussian state and society, often described as a revolution from above, demonstrating a remarkable capacity for self-renewal in the face of existential threat. They transformed Prussia from an anachronistic feudal monarchy into a more modern, efficient, and resilient state, laying the ideological and institutional groundwork for its eventual leadership in German unification. The lessons of defeat had been harsh, but the response was transformative, forging a state and a people far more capable of asserting themselves on the European stage. Historians still argue whether the primary driver of these reforms was a genuine embrace of liberal Enlightenment ideals or a pragmatic necessity born from military defeat, making the precise balance of ideology and realpolitik a fascinating, open scholarly debate. Regardless of the exact motivations, the reforms laid the groundwork for Prussia's comeback, proving that even from the depths of despair, a phoenix could rise, ready to confront its former tormentor and reclaim its place among the great powers. With the comprehensive Prussian reforms slowly but surely breathing new life into the battered kingdom, Prussia found itself poised, albeit cautiously, for its return to the European stage. A return that would be inextricably linked to the ongoing struggle against Napoleon. Imagine a boxer, knocked down in the early rounds, now slowly getting back on their feet, having spent their time on the canvas, not just recovering, but fundamentally retraining and re-strategizing, ready for the next brutal round. The reforms had instilled a new sense of national purpose and equipped Prussia with a revitalized, more modern military, ready to challenge the French hegemon. While Frederick William III, the king, remained notoriously hesitant, preferring cautious diplomacy to outright confrontation, the popular sentiment among his newly empowered citizens and reformed military leadership was increasingly one of fiery nationalism and a burning desire for revenge against the French oppressor. The opportunity for Prussia to reassert itself finally arrived with Napoleon's disastrous Russian campaign of 1812. The Grande Armée, once seemingly invincible, was annihilated by the brutal Russian winter and relentless partisan attacks, staggering back into Central Europe as a mere shadow of its former self. This catastrophic defeat sent shockwaves across the continent, signaling to the long-suffering European powers that Napoleon was, in fact, vulnerable. It was the crack in the dam, the first real sign that the seemingly endless tide of French dominance could finally be turned back. For Prussia, it was a moment of profound strategic reconsideration. Should they remain a subjugated ally of France, or seize this desperate chance to reclaim their sovereignty and dignity? Initially, Prussian forces were still compelled to fight alongside Napoleon in his retreat from Russia, a bitter irony for a nation yearning for liberation. However, as the remnants of the Grande Armée limped across Prussian territory, popular uprisings and anti-French sentiments surged, putting immense pressure on Frederick William III. The decisive moment came when General Jörg von Wartenberg, commanding the Prussian contingent still officially allied with France, made a bold and unauthorized decision. In December 1812, he signed the Convention of Tauroggen with the Russians, effectively neutralizing his corps and declaring a shaky armistice, defying Napoleon's orders and igniting the sparks of an alliance against France. It was a moment of breathtaking insubordination, a general acting on the desperate will of his nation, rather than the hesitant commands of his king. This audacious act by York, coupled with the burgeoning national spirit unleashed by the reforms and the widespread desire for liberation, left Frederick William III with little choice but to finally abandon his cautious neutrality. In March 1813, Prussia formally declared war on France, joining Russia in what would become known as the War of Liberation. This was not just a conflict of kings. It was a popular war, fueled by the newly awakened sense of German nationalism that the French occupation had inadvertently fostered. Prussian citizens, inspired by the calls of reformers and intellectuals, flocked to join the newly organized Landwehr militia, fighting with a ferocity and patriotism that had been conspicuously absent in 1806. The army, rebuilt and reformed, now marched under the banners of national pride rather than mere dynastic loyalty. The War of Liberation was a brutal, protracted struggle. initially marked by mixed fortunes for the Allied forces. Napoleon, despite his catastrophic losses in Russia, still proved to be a formidable adversary, demonstrating flashes of his old genius. However, the sheer numerical superiority of the growing coalition, now including Austria and Sweden, along with the renewed vigor and tactical flexibility of the reformed Prussian forces, began to turn the tide. Battles like Lützen and Bautzen in 1813 were costly draws, but they showed that the Prussian army could now stand its ground against the French veterans. The strategic turning point came with the massive Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, often referred to as the Battle of the Nations. This colossal engagement, one of the largest battles in European history prior to the World Wars, saw a combined Allied force, including significant Prussian contingents, decisively defeat Napoleon. It was a sprawling, multi-day melee involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers, a truly epic struggle that heralded the beginning of the end for Napoleon's empire. Prussian forces, under the command of figures like Gebhard, Leberecht, von Blücher, played a crucial role in the Allied victories. Blücher, an aging but fiery and aggressive general, became a national hero, embodying the renewed martial spirit of Prussia. His relentless pursuit of the French, often pushing his troops to their limits, contributed significantly to the ultimate downfall of Napoleon. The Prussian army, with its rejuvenated officer corps, universal conscription, and improved logistics, proved itself to be a powerful, decisive force, a far cry from the shattered remnants of 1806. The war culminated in the Allied invasion of France and the eventual capture of Paris in 1814, leading to Napoleon's first abdication. Prussia, having tasted the bitter depths of defeat, now shared in the sweet triumph of victory, regaining its status as a major European power through the sheer force of its revitalized military and the unwavering determination of its people. The experience of the Napoleonic Wars and the subsequent War of Liberation deeply ingrained a new set of values in the Prussian national consciousness, a profound belief in military strength as the ultimate guarantor of national security, a strong sense of national duty and self-sacrifice, and an emerging German nationalism that saw Prussia as a leading force in the broader German lands. Historians still argue whether the War of Liberation was primarily a pragmatic geopolitical struggle for power or a genuine expression of nascent German national identity, making the precise blend of self-interest and popular fervor a fascinating and open scholarly debate. Regardless, Prussia had risen from the ashes, its reforms validated by the crucible of war, ready to play a pivotal role in the reshaping of post-Napoleonic Europe. With Napoleon finally defeated and exiled, the grand task of reshaping a continent profoundly altered by 2 decades of revolutionary fervor and relentless warfare fell to the victorious powers, converging at the Congress of Vienna in 1814-1815. Imagine a vast, elaborate game of diplomatic chess being played on the grandest scale, with Europe itself as the board, and the future of millions of people hanging on every calculated move and whispered negotiation. For Prussia, having risen from the ashes of Jena and Auerstedt to play a crucial role in Napoleon's downfall, Vienna was not just about restoration. It was about securing its hard-won gains, consolidating its position, and ensuring its long-term security and influence within the new European order. It was their moment to cash in on their considerable sacrifices and military prowess, a well-deserved seat at the grown-ups table after years of being told to go to their room. The Congress of Vienna was an unprecedented gathering of European royalty, diplomats, and statesmen, dominated by figures like Austria's Prince Metternich, Britain's Lord Castlereagh, Russia's Tsar Alexander the Firm, and France's Talleyrand. Prussia was ably represented by Prince Karl August von Hardenberg, one of the key architects of the Prussian Reforms, and Wilhelm von Humboldt, the esteemed scholar and diplomat. Their primary objectives were clear: to regain the territories lost to Napoleon, particularly those in the West, and to gain strategic lands that would strengthen its position within Germany and secure its western frontier against any future French aggression. They certainly didn't want to be caught flat-footed again, having learned the painful lessons of geographic vulnerability. The negotiations were complex and often contentious, involving intricate horse trading and shifting alliances as each power sought to maximize its gains. Prussia initially harbored ambitions for the entirety of Saxony, whose king had remained loyal to Napoleon too long, and for considerable territorial gains in Poland. But these maximalist demands met strong resistance from Austria and Britain, who feared an overly powerful Prussia. The specter of another major war loomed, a rather uncomfortable thought, given the recent decades of bloodshed, forcing compromises. Ultimately, Prussia emerged from the Congress of Vienna as one of the principal beneficiaries, solidifying its status as a major European power, one of the great powers alongside Austria, Russia, Britain, and a restored France. While it did not gain all of Saxony, it acquired a substantial portion, significantly expanding its presence in central Germany. Crucially, Prussia received extensive new territories in the West, particularly the Rhineland and Westphalia, rich in natural resources like coal and iron, and strategically vital due to their proximity to France. This was a masterstroke, whether intended or not, setting the stage for Prussia's future industrial and economic might. Imagine being handed a deed to a vast, untouched gold mine. That was the potential these regions represented. These new western provinces, though geographically separated from the traditional Prussian heartland by other German states, were critical to its long-term development. They were densely populated, economically vibrant, and technologically advanced, bringing a dynamic new element to the largely agricultural and militaristic Prussian state. This westward shift in Prussia's center of gravity would have profound implications for its future role in German affairs, pulling it away from its traditional focus on Eastern Europe and towards the economic and political heartland of Germany. It also meant Prussia now shared a long border with France, solidifying its role as a frontline defender against French expansionism and tying its security more directly to the stability of Western Europe. In addition to these territorial gains, the Congress of Vienna saw the creation of the German Confederation, a loose association of 39 German states, replacing the defunct Holy Roman Empire. This was a significant step towards German unity, albeit a very cautious one, and Prussia, along with Austria, became the leading powers within this new confederation. While the confederation itself was weak and often paralyzed by internal rivalries, it provided a framework within which Prussia could gradually increase its influence over the other German states, particularly in economic matters. It was a bit like a newly formed club with two very dominant members constantly vying for control of the agenda. The gains from the Congress of Vienna, coupled with the success of the Prussian reforms, provided the bedrock for Prussia's ascendancy in the 19th century. Its increased size, strategic positioning, and revitalized military and administrative structures meant it was perfectly positioned to challenge Austria for leadership within Germany, and eventually to spearhead the drive for German unification. The lessons of defeat had been learned, the reforms had been implemented, and the diplomatic gains at Vienna had provided the necessary resources and geopolitical leverage. Historians still argue whether the Congress of Vienna's ultimate achievement was primarily one of stability and the prevention of future wars, or if it simply papered over underlying nationalistic and liberal tensions that would inevitably erupt later, making its long-term success as a peace settlement a nuanced and open scholarly debate. Regardless, for Prussia, Vienna was a triumph, cementing its status as a great power and setting the stage for its next phase of growth and ambition, with its territorial gains solidified at the Congress of Vienna and its internal structures rejuvenated by the reforms. Prussia, still a patchwork of geographically disparate provinces, turned its attention to the quieter, yet no less significant, battleground of economic integration, leading the charge in the formation of the Zollverein. Imagine a collection of independent, sometimes squabbling, small businesses operating in the same marketplace, each with its own quirky rules, tariffs, and currencies, making trade a bureaucratic nightmare. Then, one of them, realizing the collective benefit, proposes a system to eliminate all those internal barriers, allowing goods and capital to flow freely. That's essentially what Prussia did with the Zollverein, and it was a stroke of genius, effectively building economic unity long before political unity became a reality. In the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, the newly formed German Confederation was an economic mess. Each of the 39 member states, big and small, had its own customs duties, tariffs, and often its own currency. This fragmented economic landscape stifled trade, hindered industrial development, and created endless logistical headaches for merchants trying to move goods across state lines, having to pay a new tax and deal with a different currency every time you crossed a provincial border. It would be a logistical nightmare, wouldn't it? This economic fragmentation meant that German states, despite their shared language and culture, were unable to fully capitalize on their collective economic potential. Prussia, with its newly acquired Rhineland provinces, found itself particularly inconvenienced by this economic balkanization. Its western territories were separated from its eastern heartland by numerous smaller states, each imposing their own customs. To connect its own disparate parts and facilitate internal trade, Prussia began to form customs unions with its smaller neighbors, effectively creating free trade zones. This was a pragmatic move, initially driven by Prussia's own internal economic needs, but it quickly evolved into something much larger. The true turning point came in 1834 with the formal establishment of the Zollverein, or German Customs Union, under Prussian leadership. This wasn't merely a series of bilateral agreements. It was a comprehensive, multilateral treaty that abolished internal customs barriers among its member states and established a common external tariff. Think of it as the early 19th century equivalent of a free trade agreement like ASEAN or the EU's single market, but on a smaller regional scale, starting within the German lands. Prussia, with its robust bureaucracy and efficient administration, a legacy of the reforms, was uniquely positioned to manage such a complex undertaking, providing the administrative framework and leading the negotiations. The Zollverein was a resounding economic success, laying the crucial groundwork for Germany's industrialization and economic growth in the decades that followed. By eliminating internal tariffs, it created a much larger, unified domestic market for goods, stimulating industrial production and agricultural output. Merchants no longer faced endless customs checkpoints, and goods could flow more freely, reducing costs and increasing efficiency. This economic integration fostered specialization and economies of scale, leading to increased prosperity for member states. It also encouraged infrastructure development, as the need to transport goods efficiently spurred the construction of roads, canals, and eventually railways, further binding the German states together. Beyond its economic benefits, the Zollverein had profound political implications. It effectively excluded Austria, which, with its vast multinational empire, found it difficult to integrate its disparate economies into a German customs union. This exclusion from the most important economic bloc within Germany was a major blow to Austrian influence and leadership within the German Confederation. Conversely, it significantly enhanced Prussia's prestige and influence among the smaller German states. They saw Prussia not as a rival or an aggressor, but as a pragmatic economic partner, a leader who could deliver tangible benefits to their economies. It provided a powerful, non-military means for Prussia to assert its leadership and build closer ties with other German states, paving the way for future political unification. The Zollverein fostered a growing sense of shared German identity, an economic nationalism that began to complement the more abstract cultural nationalism that had emerged during the Napoleonic Wars. People began to realize that despite their political fragmentation, they were part of a larger interconnected German economic space. It demonstrated that cooperation on economic matters was possible and beneficial, creating a template for future political collaboration. Historians still argue whether the Zollverein was primarily an economic project driven by pragmatic considerations of trade and revenue, or if it was a deliberate political tool designed by Prussia to undermine Austrian influence and pave the way for a Prussian-led unification of Germany, making the precise balance of economic and political motivations a fascinating and open scholarly debate. By the mid-19th century, the Zollverein had become a powerful symbol of Prussian leadership and German economic strength. It had effectively created a Kleindeutsch, small German, economic space, laying the crucial non-military foundations for a future unified Germany under Prussian dominance. While the political landscape remained fragmented and the German Confederation continued its rather sleepy existence, the economic reality was rapidly moving towards greater integration, driven by Prussian efficiency and foresight. The Zollverein proved that soft power in the form of economic cooperation could be just as effective as hard power in shaping the destiny of nations, subtly preparing the German states for the more dramatic political changes that lay just over the horizon. Even as Prussia skillfully built economic bridges through the Zollverein, the mid-19th century brought with it a different kind of storm, a tempest of liberal and nationalist fervor that swept across Europe in 1848, unleashing a wave of revolutions that profoundly shook the foundations of the established monarchies, including Prussia. Imagine a seemingly calm, meticulously ordered garden suddenly erupting with wild, untamed flowers, pushing up through the manicured lawns and threatening to overwhelm the carefully cultivated beds. This was the year when the long-simmering discontent over autocratic rule, social inequality, and the burgeoning desire for national self-determination finally boiled over, challenging the very legitimacy of the traditional order. For Prussia, the revolutions of 1848 presented a complex and ultimately contradictory challenge, highlighting the deep tensions between the conservative monarchy and the growing liberal and nationalist aspirations within its burgeoning middle class and educated elite. King Frederick William IV, who had ascended the throne in 1840, was a romantic and often indecisive ruler, deeply religious and committed to the idea of a divinely ordained monarchy. He was utterly ill-equipped to handle the revolutionary tide, preferring philosophical musings and artistic pursuits to the grim realities of political upheaval. It was a bit like asking a renowned poet to suddenly command an army. The skills just don't quite translate. The revolutionary wave reached Berlin in March 1848, sparked by news of the successful uprising in Paris and fueled by local grievances over censorship, economic hardship, and the lack of political representation. Barricades went up in the streets, and clashes erupted between citizens and the royal troops, leading to significant casualties. The initially hesitant King Frederick William IV, under immense pressure, eventually bowed to the demands of the revolutionaries, famously appearing on his palace balcony to salute the fallen and promising a constitution, freedom of the press, and the convocation of a united German parliament. He even donned the black, red, and gold colors of German unity, seemingly embracing the nationalist cause, a rather surprising fashion choice for an absolute monarch. This period saw a blossoming of liberal hopes, as a Prussian National Assembly was elected to draft a new constitution, and representatives were sent to the Frankfurt Parliament. An all-German assembly convened to draft a constitution for a unified Germany. For a brief, intoxicating period, it seemed as if Prussia, and indeed all of Germany, was on the cusp of a liberal constitutional transformation, a peaceful transition from absolutism to a more representative form of government. The debates in both assemblies were lively and passionate, with liberals, Democrats, and nationalists arguing over the future shape of Germany, whether it should be a Greater Germany, including Austria, Großdeutschland, or a Lesser Germany, excluding Austria, but led by Prussia, Kleindeutschland. However, the liberal movement proved to be fleeting, and the conservative forces, initially stunned by the speed and intensity of the revolutionary fervor, began to regroup and reassert their authority. The Prussian army, though initially withdrawn from Berlin, remained loyal to the crown, and eventually proved to be the decisive factor in suppressing the revolutionary movements. Frederick William IV, emboldened by the military's unwavering support and increasingly disillusioned with the revolutionary chaos, slowly reasserted his autocratic power. He famously rejected the crown offered to him by the Frankfurt Parliament in April 1849, famously declaring he would not accept a crown from the gutter. This rejection was a clear signal that he would not accept a crown constrained by a popular constitution. He believed his authority derived from God, not from the people. Imagine being offered the keys to a kingdom, but only if you promise to follow a strict set of rules, and you just scoff and walk away. The Frankfurt Parliament, weakened by its internal divisions and lacking a military force to enforce its decisions, ultimately failed to achieve its goal of German unification. The Prussian National Assembly was dissolved, and while Frederick William IV did grudgingly issue his own, more conservative constitution in 1850, it retained significant powers for the monarchy and largely favored the traditional aristocracy, reflecting a partial concession rather than a genuine embrace of liberal principles. The revolution in Prussia and in Germany as a whole was ultimately suppressed, its liberal aspirations crushed by the combined forces of monarchical reaction and military might. Many prominent liberals and revolutionaries were forced into exile, leading to a significant brain drain from Germany. The failure of the 1848 revolutions had profound consequences for Prussia and the future of German unification. It demonstrated that German unity would not be achieved through liberal parliamentary means, but through the decisive application of military force and the pragmatic pursuit of realpolitik. The liberals had shown their weakness, and the conservatives had shown their strength. It reinforced the traditional Prussian emphasis on military power and disciplined state authority as the primary means of achieving national goals. The experience also deepened the existing divide between the liberal elements of society and the conservative militaristic state, a tension that would persist throughout the remainder of Prussian history. Historians still argue whether the failure of the 1848 revolutions was primarily due to the inherent weaknesses and divisions among the revolutionaries themselves, or if the strength and ruthless efficiency of the Prussian state and army made their suppression inevitable, making the specific causes of the revolution's demise a rich and open scholarly debate. Regardless, the abortive revolution left a clear message. The path to German unification would be paved not by speeches and parliaments, but by blood and iron, a lesson soon to be delivered by the architects of Prussia's ultimate triumph. With the echoes of the failed 1848 revolutions fading, leaving behind a clear lesson that German unity would not be forged by liberal idealists, but by pragmatic power, the stage was meticulously set for the entrance of the man who would become the very embodiment of Prussian realpolitik, Otto von Bismarck. Imagine a master craftsman observing a complex, multifaceted mechanism that others have tried and failed to assemble, then calmly stepping forward, tools in hand, to piece it together with an almost ruthless efficiency, ignoring sentimentality and focusing solely on the end result. This was Bismarck, a figure whose cunning, iron will, and singular dedication to Prussian aggrandizement would dominate German and European politics for over 2 decades, fundamentally reshaping the continent's map. Bismarck, born into an aristocratic Junker family in Brandenburg in 1815, was a towering figure both physically and intellectually, possessing a sharp wit, a formidable temper, and an unshakable belief in the strength and destiny of Prussia. His early career as a diplomat honed his understanding of international relations, his ability to read intentions, and his skill in manipulating events to his advantage. He served as Prussia's envoy to the German Confederation, then as ambassador to Russia, and later to France, gaining invaluable experience in the intricate dance of European diplomacy. These postings, far from the quiet fields of his family estate, gave him a global perspective that many of his peers lacked, allowing him to anticipate moves on the grand chessboard of international relations. His true ascendancy began in 1862, when King William I a staunch conservative and a firm believer in the strength of the Prussian army, appointed him as Minister-President of Prussia and Foreign Minister. This appointment came at a moment of significant constitutional crisis in Prussia. The liberal-dominated parliament was refusing to approve the king's ambitious plans for army reform, which included expanding military service and increasing the defense budget. William III, frustrated and on the verge of abdication, turned to Bismarck, a man known for his unflinching loyalty to the monarchy and his willingness to use unconventional methods to achieve his goals. It was a clear signal from the king that he was prepared to bypass parliamentary obstruction and rule with a firm hand, if necessary, even if it meant alienating public opinion. Bismarck wasted no time in making his intentions clear. In a famous speech to the Prussian Landtag's Budget Committee in September 1862, he declared, with a bluntness that shocked many, that the great questions of the day would not be decided by speeches and majority resolutions. That was the great mistake of 1848 and 1849, but by iron and blood. This powerful, almost brutal phrase became the unofficial motto of his political philosophy. It was a direct repudiation of liberal parliamentary politics and a forceful assertion that military strength and decisive action were the only true paths to achieving Prussian, and by extension, German, objectives. Imagine a politician today telling the parliament, "Forget all your talking, we're just going to solve this with guns and guts." It was that level of audacious, unapologetic pragmatism. True to his word, Bismarck proceeded to implement the army reforms, even without parliamentary approval, by collecting taxes and expenditures based on a controversial interpretation of previous budgets. This was a direct challenge to the authority of the parliament and a bold assertion of monarchical power. Effectively sidelining the liberal opposition, he centralized power, cracked down on dissent, and ensured that the military had all the resources it needed to be transformed into an even more formidable fighting force. Under the guidance of brilliant military minds like Helmuth von Moltke the Elder, the Prussian General Staff meticulously planned and prepared for future conflicts, integrating the latest technological advancements, particularly in railway logistics and artillery. Bismarck's rise signaled a decisive shift in Prussian politics, moving away from the hesitant and often indecisive policies of the previous decades towards a bold, assertive, and often ruthless pursuit of national interests. He was a master manipulator, playing rivals against each other, forging temporary alliances, and then abandoning them when they no longer served his purpose. His genius lay not just in his strategic vision, but in his ability to seize opportunities and adapt to changing circumstances with lightning speed, often surprising his opponents with his audacity and flexibility. He understood that in the complex arena of European power politics, moralizing was a weakness, and only strength and calculated self-interest truly mattered. This period of Bismarck's ascendancy set the stage for the dramatic events that would lead to German unification under Prussian leadership. He built on the foundations laid by Frederick the Great and the reformers after Napoleon, harnessing Prussia's military might and administrative efficiency to achieve his ultimate goal. He transformed the Prussian army into an instrument of decisive power, refined its diplomatic machinery into a precision tool, and systematically eliminated obstacles to Prussian dominance within Germany. Historians still argue whether Bismarck's actions were those of an unprincipled autocrat or a pragmatic statesman who merely did what was necessary to achieve national unity, making his ultimate legacy a subject of profound and often heated scholarly debate. Regardless, his appointment and his blood and iron declaration marked the beginning of the end for the old German Confederation and the dawn of a new Prussian-dominated era that would culminate in the creation of a unified German Empire. Having consolidated power in Prussia and boldly declared his blood and iron philosophy, Otto von Bismarck wasted no time in translating his words into action, embarking on a series of calculated wars that would systematically dismantle the existing German order and forge a unified German empire under Prussian leadership. Imagine a chess player, after meticulously setting up his pieces, launching a series of aggressive, perfectly timed attacks that ultimately lead to checkmate, one opponent at a time. This was Bismarck's strategy. 3 swift, decisive wars designed to isolate his enemies, bolster Prussian prestige, and finally achieve his long-cherished goal of German unification. The first of these conflicts was the Second Schleswig War in 1864, a seemingly localized dispute over the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, territories historically linked to Denmark, but with significant German populations. Denmark, emboldened by a new constitution that sought to fully incorporate Schleswig, defied international agreements, providing Bismarck with a perfect pretext for intervention. He shrewdly formed an alliance with Austria, traditionally Prussia's rival within the German Confederation, to jointly intervene against Denmark. This alliance served a dual purpose. It neutralized Austrian opposition to Prussian action in the short term, and it created a shared military venture that would inevitably lead to friction between the two powers, setting the stage for future conflict. It was a bit like inviting your rival to help you renovate a house, knowing full well you'll end up fighting over who gets the master bedroom. The combined Austro-Prussian forces, with the superior Prussian army playing the dominant role, quickly defeated the Danish forces. The war was short and decisive, highlighting the efficiency and modernized capabilities of the Prussian military, particularly its artillery. The subsequent Treaty of Vienna in 1864 forced Denmark to cede Schleswig, Holstein, and Lauenburg to Austria and Prussia jointly. However, the joint administration of these duchies, particularly Schleswig and Holstein, became a constant source of tension between the two victorious powers, exactly as Bismarck had intended. The precise arrangement for their future status became a diplomatic quagmire, deliberately exacerbated by Bismarck to provoke a confrontation with Austria, his ultimate target for dominance within Germany. This manufactured tension exploded in 1866 with the Austro-Prussian War, often referred to as the 7 Weeks' War due to its remarkably short duration. Bismarck expertly isolated Austria diplomatically, securing Italian support, who coveted Austrian Venice, and ensuring French neutrality through vague promises of territorial compensation. He framed the conflict not as a war of aggression, but as a struggle for the leadership of Germany, arguing for a Klein Deutsch, small German solution under Prussian leadership, excluding multi-ethnic Austria from German affairs. This was the decisive moment, the ultimate showdown between the two great powers vying for supremacy in Germany. The Prussian military, under the brilliant strategic direction of Chief of Staff Helmuth von Moltke the Elder, and equipped with the revolutionary Dreissee needle gun, a breech-loading rifle that offered a significant advantage in rate of fire over Austria's muzzle loaders, achieved a stunning and rapid victory. The decisive engagement was the Battle of Königgrätz, or Sadowa, on July 3, 1866, where the Prussians inflicted a crushing defeat on the main Austrian army. It was a technological and tactical triumph for Prussia, showcasing its superior logistics, railway mobilization, and highly trained general staff. Imagine a modern army fighting a traditional one. The outcome was almost predetermined. Bismarck, despite some calls for more punitive terms from King William III, wisely pursued a moderate peace, the Peace of Prague, signed in August 1866. He understood that humiliating Austria would only foster resentment and potentially lead to a future war of revenge. Instead, Austria was merely excluded from the German Confederation, which was then dissolved, and Prussia annexed Schleswig, Holstein, Hanover, Hesse-Kassel, Nassau, and the city of Frankfurt. These annexations were crucial, finally connecting Prussia's Rhineland provinces with its eastern territories, creating a geographically unified North German state. The North German Confederation was then established under Prussian hegemony, formally bringing together the states north of the main river under a Prussian-dominated federal structure. This was a massive step towards full unification, demonstrating that blood and iron could indeed achieve what liberal speeches had failed to do. The final act in Bismarck's unification drama was the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871. France, under Napoleon III, increasingly viewed Prussia's growing power with alarm and sought to prevent further German unification, particularly the inclusion of the southern German states into the Prussian sphere. Bismarck, ever the opportunist, skillfully manufactured a casus belli, manipulating a diplomatic telegram, the Ems dispatch, to provoke France into declaring war, making Prussia appear as the aggrieved party. This was a calculated risk, but Bismarck was confident in his military, and he knew that a war against an external enemy would finally bring the southern German states, who harbored some distrust of Prussia, into the fold. Once again, the Prussian-led German forces, under Moltke's command, proved overwhelmingly superior. The German armies rapidly mobilized, crushed the French at key battles like Sedan, where Napoleon III himself was captured, and laid siege to Paris. The war not only demonstrated Prussian military superiority, but also the deep sense of national unity that had been forged through the previous conflicts and the shared struggle against France. The speed and efficiency of the German victory shocked Europe. Historians still argue whether the Franco-Prussian War was an inevitable clash between two rising powers, or if Bismarck deliberately engineered it for political purposes, making the precise blend of unavoidable conflict and cunning manipulation a complex and open scholarly debate. Regardless, the outcome was undeniable: a unified German Empire. The swift and decisive victory in the Franco-Prussian War brought to fruition Otto von Bismarck's decades-long strategic machinations, culminating in the triumphant founding of the German Empire in 1871. Imagine a magnificent, complex jigsaw puzzle with pieces meticulously cut and carefully positioned over generations, finally slotting together with a resounding click, creating a grand, unified picture. This wasn't merely a political declaration. It was the culmination of centuries of Prussian ambition, a testament to its military might, administrative efficiency, and the cunning political artistry of its Iron Chancellor. The fragmented German lands, long a battleground for competing dynastic and religious interests, were at last united under a single powerful banner. Though not quite in the liberal democratic way many had once envisioned, the formal proclamation of the German Empire was fittingly a military affair steeped in Prussian symbolism and martial pride. It took place on January 18th, 1871, not in a democratic assembly in Berlin, but in the opulent Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, just outside a besieged Paris. This symbolic choice of location, deep within the territory of the defeated enemy, sent a clear message to France and the rest of Europe. German unity had been forged through blood and iron, and it was now a formidable power to be reckoned with. Imagine the sheer audacity and psychological impact of such a ceremony, crowning your new empire in the very halls where a defeated foe once lorded over Europe. In that grand hall, amidst hundreds of German princes, military commanders, and statesmen, King William I of Prussia was proclaimed German Emperor, Deutscher Kaiser. This was a carefully chosen title. Bismarck, ever the pragmatist, ensured he was German Emperor rather than Emperor of Germany. A subtle but important distinction designed to appease the sensibilities of the other German monarchs who retained considerable autonomy within the new federal structure. It was a compromise that preserved the dignity of Bavaria, Saxony, and Württemberg, allowing them to retain their own armies, railway systems, and even some diplomatic representation, while acknowledging the overarching supremacy of the Prussian monarch. It was a bit like a highly successful business merger, where the acquired companies retain their brand names but operate under the ultimate authority of the new parent corporation. The new German Empire was a federation of 25 constituent states, with Prussia by far the largest and most dominant. It comprised about 2/3 of the new empire's territory and population, giving it an undeniable gravitational pull. The imperial constitution, largely drafted by Bismarck, enshrined Prussian supremacy. The King of Prussia was automatically the German Emperor. The Prussian minister-president was also the imperial chancellor, a position Bismarck held, giving him immense power to direct imperial policy. The Prussian army formed the core of the Imperial German Army, and Prussian administrative and legal systems often served as the model for the new empire. It was, in essence, a greater Prussia disguised as a federal empire, much to the chagrin of some southern German states, who initially bristled at this dominance. Bismarck's role as the first imperial chancellor was pivotal. He continued to manage the complex internal and external affairs of the new empire, with his characteristic blend of ruthlessness and diplomatic genius. Internally, he embarked on the Kulturkampf, a struggle against the influence of the Catholic Church, which he viewed as a threat to national unity, though this campaign ultimately proved largely unsuccessful. He also introduced pioneering social welfare legislation, including health insurance, accident insurance, and old age pensions, a surprisingly progressive move for a conservative statesman, designed to win the loyalty of the working class and preempt socialist agitation. Imagine a fiercely capitalist country suddenly introducing universal health care, and you get a sense of the pragmatic shock this caused. Externally, Bismarck pursued a policy of maintaining peace and stability in Europe, recognizing that the newly unified German Empire needed time to consolidate its gains and avoid provoking a coalition of its neighbors. He skillfully constructed a complex web of alliances, primarily with Austria-Hungary and Russia, the Three Emperors League, later the Triple Alliance, designed to isolate France and prevent any attempts at revenge. A diplomatic high-wire act that earned him the title of Honest Broker of Europe. His diplomatic brilliance kept Europe largely at peace for 2 decades after unification, a period often referred to as the Bismarckian system of alliances. The founding of the German Empire was the crowning achievement of Prussian history. It represented the culmination of centuries of Hohenzollern expansion, the validation of Frederick the Great's militaristic state-building, and the ultimate triumph of the Prussian Reforms after the Napoleonic humiliation. Prussia had successfully used its military prowess and administrative efficiency to forge a unified nation, fulfilling a long-held German nationalist dream, albeit one dictated by Prussian terms. It created a powerful, industrially dynamic new player on the European stage, irrevocably altering the balance of power and setting the trajectory for the next century of European history. However, this triumph also came with inherent tensions and contradictions. The highly militaristic and authoritarian nature of the new empire, dominated by Prussia's conservative aristocracy and powerful army, left little room for genuine parliamentary democracy or liberal values, despite the existence of a Reichstag elected by universal male suffrage. The iron and blood mentality that forged the empire also ingrained a certain rigidity and an emphasis on military solutions that would prove problematic in the long run. Historians still argue whether the Prussian-led unification of Germany was a necessary step towards modernization and national strength, or if it fundamentally flawed the new empire by embedding a militaristic and authoritarian ethos that ultimately contributed to later conflicts, making the precise nature of its legacy a profound and open scholarly debate. Regardless, Prussia, through its own transformation and the genius of Bismarck, had brought forth a new giant onto the world stage, a Germany that would soon eclipse its Prussian progenitor. With the creation of the German Empire in 1871, Prussia found itself in a paradoxical position. It had achieved its centuries-long ambition of unifying Germany under its leadership. Yet in doing so, it began a slow, almost imperceptible process of diminishing its own distinctiveness within the very empire it had forged. Imagine a parent who pours all their energy into raising a brilliant, independent child, only to find that the child, once grown, begins to overshadow and absorb the parent's identity. That was, in many ways, the fate of Prussia within the German Empire. It was the largest and most powerful state. Its king was the German emperor, and its institutions formed the backbone of the new imperial structure. Yet over time, the unique Prussian character began to dilute, subsumed by a broader German identity and the demands of empire. While Prussia was undoubtedly dominant, comprising about 2/3 of the empire's territory and population, the very act of unification meant a delegation of certain powers to the new imperial government. Areas like foreign policy, military affairs, customs, and much of the legal system became imperial competencies rather than purely Prussian ones. Bismarck, as imperial chancellor, held immense power, but he acted in an imperial capacity, balancing the interests of all the German states, not just Prussia. This centralization, though led by Prussians, ironically reduced some of Prussia's specific independent authority. It was like a company CEO who, after acquiring several smaller firms, has to start thinking about the overall corporate identity rather than just the original brand. The Prussian Landtag, Parliament, continued to exist, and Prussia retained its own administration. But the national focus shifted to the Reichstag, the imperial parliament, and the figure of the emperor. The Prussian military, once exclusively loyal to the Hohenzollerns, became the core of the Imperial German army. Its distinctive uniforms and traditions gradually integrated into a broader imperial force, though the Prussian ethos of discipline and efficiency certainly permeated the entire military. The famed Prussian General Staff became the Imperial General Staff, its strategic planning now serving all of Germany. The lines began to blur between what was purely Prussian and what was German. Economically, the empire's rapid industrialization, largely fueled by the resources of the former Prussian territories, like the Ruhr, transformed the entire nation, not just Prussia. The economic success of the Zollverein, now expanded to the entire empire, created a vast integrated market that benefited all regions. While Prussian industrial centers boomed, the economic growth was a German phenomenon, reflecting the collective strength of the unified nation rather than solely Prussian ingenuity. The prosperity generated by this industrial boom benefited the empire as a whole, drawing resources and talent from across Germany. However, the continued dominance of the Junker class, the conservative Prussian, landed aristocracy within the Prussian political system and, by extension, within the imperial government, became a source of increasing tension within the new empire. Prussia's voting system for its Landtag, known as the three-class franchise, was highly undemocratic, disproportionately favoring the wealthy and essentially ensuring continued conservative control, despite the universal male suffrage for the imperial Reichstag. This created a peculiar dualism: a progressive imperial parliament elected by all men, and a deeply conservative Prussian state parliament controlled by a privileged few. This disparity became a major point of contention for liberals and socialists, who saw it as a fundamental flaw in the empire's democratic credentials and a symbol of outdated privilege. It was a bit like having a modern, innovative national government trying to pull a country forward, while its largest component state is still stuck in the past with a highly traditional, old-fashioned local council. The very success of the German Empire began to dilute Prussia's identity. People increasingly saw themselves as Germans first, and Prussians second or even third, after their regional identities. The dynamic energy of the new empire, its growing international ambitions, and its burgeoning industrial and urban centers, fostered a broader sense of German nationhood that gradually overshadowed the particularisms of its constituent states, including Prussia. The Kaiser, despite being King of Prussia, focused more on his imperial role, symbolizing the unity of all Germans rather than just Prussians. The end of Bismarck's chancellorship in 1890, dismissed by the young Kaiser Wilhelm II, further accelerated this process. Wilhelm II, eager to assert his own authority and embark on a more aggressive foreign policy, often bypassed the cautious Prussian-centric diplomacy of Bismarck. While the Prussian ethos of military discipline and bureaucratic efficiency continued to permeate the imperial government and military, the unique political and cultural distinctiveness of Prussia slowly faded into the broader German identity. Historians still argue whether Prussia's dominance ultimately stifled the the development of a truly democratic and unified German identity, or if it was a necessary pragmatic force that ensured the survival and strength of the new empire in a hostile world, making the long-term societal impact of its continued influence a rich and open scholarly debate. Regardless, Prussia, the state that had painstakingly built itself into a European powerhouse and then forged an empire, was now beginning to be consumed by its own creation, its specific identity gradually dissolving into the grander narrative of a united Germany heading towards an uncertain future. As the 20th century dawned, the meticulously crafted German Empire, with Prussia at its core, embarked upon a path of increasing global ambition, driven by its burgeoning industrial might and a growing sense of national assertiveness. However, this era of unprecedented growth and international maneuvering would ultimately lead to a catastrophic global conflict that would fundamentally alter the course of history and in its wake seal the fate of Prussia itself. World War I. Imagine a highly sophisticated, intricately wound clockwork mechanism designed for precision and power, suddenly spinning out of control, its gears grinding, rushing towards an inevitable, violent explosion. The Prussian legacy of militarism, efficiency, and a powerful, unquestioning general staff, which had been so instrumental in forging the empire, now became a significant factor in its calamitous downfall. While the German Empire was a federal state, the Prussian dominance within it meant that Prussian values, particularly its deep-seated respect for military authority and its hierarchical social structure, profoundly influenced imperial policy. Kaiser Wilhelm II, though technically the emperor of all Germany, was first and foremost King of Prussia, and his personal style, marked by a love for military display and a sometimes bombastic rhetoric, mirrored the traditional Prussian emphasis on martial glory. The Prussian General Staff, under figures like Alfred von Schlieffen and later Helmut von Moltke, the Younger, continued to hold immense sway, meticulously planning for future wars and exerting significant influence over political decisions, often prioritizing military considerations above diplomatic ones. It was a bit like having the loudest voice in the boardroom, always belonging to the head of security, rather than the sales or marketing team. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in June 1914 set off a chain reaction of diplomatic failures and military mobilizations that quickly engulfed Europe. Germany, heavily influenced by its general staff's inflexible war plans, like the famous Schlieffen Plan, which called for a rapid offensive through Belgium to defeat France before turning attention to Russia, played a critical role in escalating the crisis into a full-blown war. The Prussian military ethos of decisive action and preemptive strikes contributed to the rapid descent into conflict, as leaders believed that swift military action was the best way to secure Germany's strategic position, rather than prolonged diplomatic negotiation. They were, in a sense, victims of their own past successes, believing that the same methods that unified Germany could be applied to broader European power struggles. World War I was unlike any conflict that had come before. The Prussian-led German army, initially achieving significant successes on the Western Front, soon found itself bogged down in the brutal, static warfare of the trenches, a meat grinder that consumed millions of lives. The rapid maneuvers and decisive victories of Bismarck's wars gave way to years of attritional warfare, characterized by massive casualties. Technological innovation applied to destruction, think poison gas and tanks, and a complete disregard for human life. The meticulous Prussian planning and logistical prowess were put to the ultimate test. And while the German war machine proved incredibly resilient, it was fighting a war of attrition against an increasingly global coalition of powers, far beyond anything even Frederick the Great could have imagined. On the Eastern Front, the German army, still largely Prussian in character, achieved more dynamic victories against Russia, forcing the collapse of the Tsarist regime and leading to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918, which gave Germany vast territorial gains in the east. However, these victories came at a heavy cost in resources and manpower, diverting crucial forces from the Western Front, where the decisive battles were being fought. The war transformed German society, imposing immense strain on its economy and social fabric, leading to widespread food shortages, inflation, and growing social unrest. The initial patriotic fervor gave way to disillusionment and exhaustion, reflecting the sheer brutality and unprecedented scale of the conflict. By late 1918, after years of relentless fighting and the entry of the United States into the war, the German war effort finally collapsed. The German army, despite its valiant resistance, was exhausted, its resources depleted, and its populace on the brink of revolt. The High Command, led by figures like Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, effectively became the real power in Germany during the latter stages of the war, overriding civilian government and implementing increasingly desperate measures, further cementing the image of a state dominated by its military. The defeat of Germany in World War I and the subsequent collapse of the monarchy and the empire signaled the definitive end of Prussia as the dominant force in German politics. The abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was King of Prussia, simultaneously ended the Hohenzollern dynasty's rule over both the empire and Prussia itself. The Prussian General Staff, once the epitome of military excellence, now faced the ignominy of defeat and the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which severely limited Germany's military capabilities and imposed heavy reparations. Historians still argue whether the Prussian military's influence on imperial policy was the primary cause of Germany's entry into World War I, or if other geopolitical factors and diplomatic miscalculations played a more significant role, making the precise balance of blame a complex and deeply contested scholarly debate. However, the connection between Prussia's militaristic tradition and the outbreak and conduct of the war is undeniable, leaving an indelible mark on its legacy. The war's devastating aftermath brought not only political upheaval, but also profound social and economic disruption, forever altering the landscape of Germany. For Prussia, its role in the empire's downfall and its association with the perceived excesses of German militarism meant that its future as a distinct entity would soon be called into question, leading to its ultimate, quiet demise in the wake of an even greater global catastrophe. The devastating aftermath of World War I and the subsequent collapse of the German Empire ushered in a tumultuous period. For Germany and for Prussia, it marked the beginning of its slow, almost theatrical exit from the stage of history, its distinct identity gradually fading into the broader German narrative. Imagine a once grand, beloved actor, after a long and storied career, accepting smaller and smaller roles, until finally the curtain falls for good, and they become a cherished memory rather than a living presence. The defeat of 1918 and the subsequent Weimar Republic saw Prussia stripped of its historical preeminence, its once unquestioned authority diluted, and its very existence questioned, leading to its eventual definitive dissolution after an even more brutal global conflict. Following the armistice and the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II, the German Empire transitioned into the Weimar Republic, a democratic parliamentary system. Prussia, still the largest German state, became a free state, Freistaat Preußen, within this new republic. However, its traditional power and influence were significantly curtailed. The old Prussian three-class franchise was abolished, paving the way for a more democratic regional parliament, and the traditional dominance of the Junker aristocracy began to wane. The Social Democrats, a strong political force in the industrial heartlands of Prussia, often held considerable sway in the Prussian government, a stark contrast to its conservative militaristic past. This shift was a significant departure from centuries of Hohenzollern rule and Prussian militarism, reflecting a genuine attempt to democratize the state. Despite its continued size, Prussia, within the Weimar Republic, was no longer the driving force it once was. Its history and traditions were often viewed with suspicion by more democratic and anti-militarist elements within Germany, who associated Prussianism with the authoritarianism and bellicosity that had led to the Great War. The very name Prussia became for some synonymous with the perceived rigidities and anachronisms of the old imperial order. It was a bit like a once dominant sports team, after a humiliating defeat, suddenly being viewed with a mixture of resentment and pity, its former glory now tinged with the bitterness of failure. This sentiment meant that even within a democratic Germany, Prussia struggled to redefine its role and shed the weight of its past. The rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in the early 1930s delivered the final fatal blow to the remaining vestiges of Prussian distinctiveness. Hitler, despite benefiting from the deeply ingrained traditions of order and obedience that Prussia had fostered, held a fundamental disdain for the traditional Prussian elite, viewing them as too conservative and too rooted in the old imperial ways for his revolutionary vision of a totalitarian state. He also harbored a deep suspicion of any regional power that could potentially challenge his centralized authority. The Nazis swiftly moved to dismantle the federal structure of the Weimar Republic and establish a highly centralized unitary state. In 1932, just before Hitler formally came to power, the Prussian government, still largely social democratic, was effectively overthrown in what was known as the Preußenschlag, Prussian coup, a move orchestrated by Chancellor Franz von Papen under the pretext of restoring order. This was a critical step in the Nazis' consolidation of power, as it neutralized the largest and most influential state government that could have potentially resisted their rise. Once in power in 1933, the Nazis completed the process of centralizing control, effectively abolishing Prussian autonomy and integrating its administration directly into the Reich government. The Prussian Landtag was dissolved, and its ministries were either absorbed by imperial ones or rendered powerless. The historic provinces of Prussia continued to exist as administrative units, but they were directly controlled by the Nazi regime, often under the direct rule of Nazi Gauleiters, regional leaders. It was like a powerful, independent country suddenly becoming just another department within a massive, autocratic bureaucracy, its unique identity erased by executive fiat. World War II, a conflict even more devastating than its predecessor, ultimately sealed Prussia's formal fate. The war's end in 1945 saw Germany utterly defeated and divided by the Allied powers. The historic lands of Prussia, particularly its eastern territories, bore the brunt of the war's final brutal campaigns and were subject to massive territorial changes. Large portions of East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia were annexed by Poland and the Soviet Union, leading to the forced expulsion of millions of ethnic Germans, a profound and tragic demographic shift. The remaining parts of Prussia were incorporated into the new occupation zones controlled by the victorious Allies. Finally, in 1947, the Allied Control Council, governing occupied Germany, formally issued Control Council Law No. 46, which officially abolished the State of Prussia. The law declared that the State of Prussia, which from early days has been a bearer of militarism and reaction in Germany, has ceased to exist. This was a definitive legal act of termination, marking the end of Prussia as a distinct political entity, a deliberate and symbolic act by the victorious powers to eradicate the source of German militarism and authoritarianism as they perceived it. It was the final, irreversible curtain call for an entity that had shaped European history for centuries, its name now inextricably linked in the minds of the victors with the dark specters of militarism and war. The legacy of Prussia is complex and deeply contested. For some, it represents the epitome of efficiency, discipline, duty, and a pioneering spirit that forged a unified Germany. For others, it symbolizes authoritarianism, militarism, and the seeds of Germany's catastrophic 20th century wars. Its profound impact on German history, its unique administrative structures, its emphasis on education and the rule of law, and its formidable military tradition remain subjects of ongoing scholarly debate. Today, Prussia exists only in history books, its name primarily invoked when discussing the origins of modern Germany or the complexities of its past. The lands it once encompassed are now parts of modern Germany, Poland, Russia, and Lithuania. Its borders erased, its political entity dissolved, but its influence, for better or worse, continues to echo through the corridors of European history, a potent reminder of a once powerful empire that ultimately vanished, leaving behind a profound and lingering imprint. And with that, dear listener, the long and winding tale of the Prussian Empire finally draws to its quiet historical close. Sweet dreams